fourth invitation burned in the grate before Philippa could read her friend's name on the envelope. She did not lift her eyes. She only pushed the needle through the worn linen of her nightdress and let the cold of the north wing settle into her fingers. In faded puce and a shawl the color of ash, Philippa Harcourt, daughter of the late Duke of Marsden, mended her own hem beside a fire that was not lit for her. Across the room, in half-mourning silk and jet, the Dowager Duchess Cressida spoke the word convent as if it were a favor. Norfolk, by the end of the month. A carriage already arranged. That night, an old solicitor named Ambrose Pennington pressed a small iron key into Philippa's palm and did not stay to explain. Before dawn, she stood alone in her father's locked study, and behind a battered volume of Blackstone she found a sealed codicil dated 1816, restoring to her £30,000, 2 estates, and naming a man she had never met as executor. She wrapped it in puce velvet and hid it against her heart. Miles south, the Duke of Bramwell, still limping from Corunna, was already riding north. He came to hear one version of a will. He would leave believing another. But what he had not yet seen, and what Cressida did not yet know had been found. Before the story begins, comment down below where you are watching from and what time it is there. If stories of justice, dignity, and love that arrives against all odds move you, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click join to become a member and help our channel. The needle slipped through the muslin and pricked her thumb, and Philippa Harcourt did not flinch. A single bead of blood welled on the pad of her finger. She wiped it against the underside of the fabric, where no one would see, and pushed the needle through again. November of 1817 lay heavy on the north wing of Marsden Hall. The fire in the hearth was small and mean, a stingy tongue of flame licking at green wood that hissed more than it burned. Frost had crept up the inside of the tall sash window and drawn a lace of its own across the panes. Outside, the park lay silvered and still, oaks stripped naked, the long drive a pale scar through the meadow. Philippa sat by the window because the light was better there, though the cold cut through her wool shawl and settled in her bones. Her fingers were stiff. She had been mending the same nightgown for the better part of an hour, coaxing thread through fabric so thin it was more memory than cloth. The gown had been her mother's. She would not have said so aloud. She said very little aloud these days. Speech in Marsden Hall had become a currency she could no longer afford. Downstairs, a door opened and closed. A voice rose, then dropped. The house had ears. The house had eyes. Philippa knew every board that creaked, every corner where a footman might linger with instructions to listen. She set the last stitch and bit the thread. Her teeth were even and small and clean. That much, at least, the cold had not yet spoiled. She folded the mended nightgown into her lap and looked out at the drive. A horse was coming up it. Not a fine horse. A serviceable bay, mud to the knees, ridden hard. The rider swung down before the animal had fully stopped and handed the reins to a groom without turning his head. He carried a leather case pressed to his ribs. Mr. Pennington, she thought, and he has ridden through frost with something in that case. She rose. The nightgown slipped from her lap to the boards and she caught it before it touched. There was a particular way she moved through Marsden Hall now, careful of hems, careful of hinges, careful of being where she was expected to be at the hour she was expected to be there. She smoothed the faded puce of her day dress. The color had once been the deep, dusty purple of a bruised plum. 3 winters of laundering had drained it to a shade she thought resembled dead leaves. She tucked the ivory cameo further down into her bodice and left the room. The corridor smelled of damp plaster and old smoke. At the head of the great staircase she paused, one hand on the newel, and listened. A woman's voice was carrying up from the yellow drawing room. Cressida Harcourt, Dowager Duchess of Marsden, had a way of speaking that filled a house whether she raised her voice or not. "So kind of you to call, Mr. Pennington. And in such weather. Do sit. Renshaw, bring the man some hot punch. Your Grace is most gracious. I shall not detain you long. There is a matter concerning the young lady's future which I—" "Ah, the young lady?" Philippa descended 2 steps. 3. The yellow drawing room stood at the foot of the stair, its double doors open a hand's breadth. Firelight quivered across the polished boards of the hall. She stopped where the shadow of the landing fell over her. Cressida sat by the fire in half-mourning, gray lavender silk and black crepe layered over her thin frame, gloves black to above the elbow. She had a slim letter in her hand. Philippa knew the paper. It was cream, and its edge was scalloped, and it bore the small blue seal of Bramwell. The fourth invitation from Lady May Ashley to visit at Bramwell Park. Philippa had watched, unseen, when the first had arrived, and the second, and the third. Cressida turned the letter in her fingers as if considering an insect. "Miss Harcourt is quite decided," she said. "She will retire from the world at the end of the month. St. Etheldreda's, in Norfolk, a house of Anglican penitents, contemplative, very strict. Her father, God rest him, always feared she inclined toward melancholy." Pennington's voice, when it came, was small and dry as a page turning. "Her Grace's late father made no such provision in the will The will I hold speaks otherwise, sir." Cressida rose. She crossed to the hearth in 3 unhurried strides. The letter went into the fire. The wax seal spat blue, then blackened, then the paper curled and lifted and was gone. She held her palm to the flame as though warming it. "That is my answer to Lady Ashley," she said. "You will forgive me. I have written enough polite refusals for one autumn." On the landing, Philippa did not breathe. Her hands closed on the newel until the wood printed itself into her palm. The old scar on the back of her left hand, a pale silver line where a broken window pane had once opened her skin the winter after her mother died, throbbed against the cold varnish. Norfolk, St. Etheldreda's. She had heard of it. Every gentleman's daughter had heard of it. Women went in and did not come out. Widows too proud for a nephew's charity. Girls too shamed for the marriage mart. Wards whose guardians preferred them silent. She was 22. She had been kept from society for 3 seasons. She had watched the world through the window, and she had endured. She let out one slow breath. She turned. She climbed the stair without haste and without sound, and she was in the corridor of the north wing again before her heart caught up with the rest of her. She was walking toward her own door when a hand closed on her sleeve. Mrs. Burskoff. The old housekeeper's fingers were red and cold. Her white cap was very neat. She did not look at Philippa's face. She looked past her, down the corridor, and her ring of iron keys did not jangle at her waist, which meant she had gathered them in her fist to keep them silent. "Come," she said. She drew Philippa into the linen press and pushed the door to behind them. The little room smelled of lavender and old cedar. A single narrow window let in a bar of gray light. Mrs. Burskoff set her back to the door. "Mr. Pennington is here," she said. "I know. He rode out from Lichfield at 4 o'clock this morning. He is not permitted to speak to you. Her Grace has instructed the footman." Philippa did not answer. The housekeeper's eyes were steady and full of something that had waited a long time to be said. "He gave me this in the yard." She held out her fist and opened her fingers. In her broad palm lay a key. It was small and iron and old, and the ward at its end was cut in a pattern Philippa did not recognize. A scrap of paper had been twisted through the loop. "He said," Mrs. Burskoff continued, and her voice went lower, "that the young lady is to come to the master's cabinet after the house has slept. He said the young lady is to look behind Blackstone." Philippa took the key. It was warm from the housekeeper's hand. "Blackstone? Your father's copy of the commentaries, 3 volumes, second shelf from the top. Master read it every evening the year he sickened. The cabinet is locked. That key is not for the cabinet door, miss. That key is for what is inside." Mrs. Burskoff's mouth pressed thin. "I do not know more. Mr. Pennington would not say, but he said this, that your father did not leave you to the ruin they have made of you." Philippa closed her hand around the key. The metal was very small in her palm. "Why now?" she said. "Because her Grace has sent for the coach for St. Etheldreda's. It comes in 3 days." The housekeeper's shoulders lifted once and dropped. "You must not be caught with it, miss, nor with anything you find, not even for an hour. She has ears in the walls, she has Renshaw at the stables, she has that man from Cheapside who calls himself a solicitor. She has bought half the servants and frightened the rest. You must be very careful. I have been careful for 3 years. I know it, miss. God knows it." Mrs. Burskoff opened the door. In the corridor there was nothing but gray afternoon and the smell of cold wood. She stepped out first. Philippa followed a moment later, the key already threaded onto the black ribbon that held the cameo inside her stays. She reached her own room and closed the door and stood with her back against it and breathed. She did not weep. She had lost the habit. She sat down at the escritoire under the window and drew a sheet of the coarse paper Cressida allowed her, and she wrote nothing on it. She sat with the pen unsharpened in her hand, and she rehearsed the shape of the corridor from her door to the master's cabinet. The stair, the gallery, the 2 turns, the length of the long passage, the loose board 6 feet from the cabinet door. She heard the front door of the house open below her and close. Mr. Pennington was going. She rose and stepped to the window. The old lawyer stood on the drive, buttoning his greatcoat under his chin. He did not look up. Renshaw the coachman held his bridle. He mounted stiffly. His head bent once, only once, toward the north wing of the house, and his gloved hand touched the brim of his hat as if to a lady he could not name. Then he was riding away, the bay's hooves throwing up small dark clods of frozen mud, and the drive was empty again. Philippa stood at the window a long time. The last light thinned. A crow lifted from an oak and cut a black slice across the sky. Behind her, footsteps. The door opened without a knock. Cressida Harcourt stood in the frame. The Dowager Duchess did not enter fully. She never did. She stood in doorways as though a room were a matter she had not yet decided to condescend to. The half-mourning made her look taller than she was. The little black jet brooch with the twist of the late Duke's hair pinned high at her throat caught the dying light. "Child." Philippa turned from the window. She did not curtsy. She had learned, long ago, that a curtsy given without cause was one more thing Cressida would take. "Your Grace, you will have wondered why Mr. Pennington called." "I did not wonder, ma'am. I assumed it was a state business." Cressida's eyes were the pale green of shallow water in winter. "A matter to be settled. He is old. He is fond of old arrangements. I have corrected him." "Yes, ma'am. You will not receive letters from Lady Ashley." "I have not received any." "Then we understand each other." Cressida's gaze traveled across the room. The narrow bed, the empty grate, the little escritoire, the mended nightgown folded on its chair. Her nostrils moved once, delicately, as though she had smelled something not quite fresh. "The coach will come on Friday morning. Renshaw drives. You will pack 1 trunk. Your father's people at St. Etheldrada's will provide what else you require. The Reverend Mother writes that she looks forward to receiving you." Philippa said nothing. "You do not thank me?" "For what, ma'am?" Cressida smiled. It was a small, precise expression that used nothing above the mouth. "For a life of contemplation, child, you always were of a serious cast. Your father used to say you were made for God. I merely make his wish flesh." She let the door close behind her. Philippa stood at the window until her hands stopped shaking. Then she sat down on the edge of the bed and she waited for the house to sleep. Supper was carried up on a tray by a maid who did not meet her eyes. Cold beef, a dish of stewed carrots, a small loaf, water. Philippa ate every bite methodically, the way a soldier eats before a march. She had been the daughter of a duke. She had learned to walk without stumbling in a ballroom before she had learned to say her catechism. She also knew what it was to be hungry at 3 in the morning when there was no one who would bring a candle. At 9 o'clock, the maid came for the tray. At 10, the bell in the servants' hall rang for prayers. At 1:30, the house began its long, slow business of settling. Coals raked, doors barred, the great front door bolted. The night watchman, an old pensioner Cressida had put in Marsden livery only last spring, took up his post in the porter's chair at the foot of the main stair. Philippa put out her candle at 11. She did not undress. She sat by the dead fire and she counted. She counted the strokes of the long case clock in the hall. She counted the hours she had been kept from London. She counted the letters from Lady Ashley she had never seen and now knew existed. 1, 2, 3, 4. She counted the coins in her purse. There were 5, and one was a shilling of Queen Anne with a bent edge her father had given her the summer she was 7. At 2 in the morning she stood. She wrapped the gray shawl over her shoulders, and she took her candle unlit in her hand, and she stepped out of her room in her stockinged feet. The corridor was cold. Her breath went before her in a white feather. The floorboards were kind to her. She knew each one by its complaint. She moved along the wall where the joists gave less. She turned at the gallery and she went down. The porter snored in the porter's chair. His head was tipped back, his mouth open, a small snuffle in and out of it like an old dog dreaming. A bottle stood by his boot. Cressida did not permit spirits in the house. Someone had been generous to him. She wondered, in passing, whether Mrs. Burskoff had been that someone. She crossed the marble of the hall on the balls of her feet. The chill of it bit through her stockings. She did not think of it. She thought only of the door at the end of the west passage, the master's cabinet, her father's room, closed since his death, and Cressida had said the key was lost, and Philippa had believed her, and Philippa had never asked again. The passage was long. The candle in her hand was unlit and useless. She trailed her fingers along the paneling because she did not trust her eyes in the dark. She found the door by touch. She found the loose board 6 feet from it and stepped over it without thinking. She turned the handle. It was not locked. Of course it was not locked, she thought. Cressida had emptied the room years ago. There was no need to lock what one had already stripped. She stepped inside and drew the door to behind her. The cabinet was as she remembered and utterly changed. The great writing table remained under the window. The map of the Marsden estates still hung on the east wall in its blackened frame. The 2 globes stood in their brass cradles, but the papers were gone from the drawers. The inkwells were dry. The chair where her father had sat in his last long illness when he had summoned her to read him the newspaper had been shrouded in holland cloth. And on the shelves, the books. Cressida had not troubled with the books. Cressida did not read. Philippa's mother had loved this room. Philippa's father had died in it. Philippa had not crossed its threshold in 3 years and 8 months. She let herself feel that for one breath. Only one. Then she moved. She lit the candle. The wick caught with a small orange bloom that made a hollow of the room around her. "Second shelf from the top," Mrs. Burskoff had said. She raised the candle. She counted along. 3 tall volumes bound in dark green calf, the gilt on the spines faded but legible. Blackstone, Commentaries on the Laws of England. Her father had read them every evening the year he sickened. She remembered his voice, thin by the end, working through a sentence about entail. The books were pushed a little forward on the shelf, as though someone had drawn them out and set them back and had not quite been careful. Philippa reached up and slid the middle volume free. Behind it, against the wooden back of the shelf, there was a small brass door. It was no bigger than a prayer book. It was fitted flush. It had been painted over with the same dark stain as the shelf, and unless a person had removed the book that hid it, no eye would have found it. There was a keyhole no larger than a wren's eye. Philippa set the candle down on the writing table. She drew the small iron key from the ribbon at her breast. She lifted it to the lock. It turned as though it had been oiled that morning. The little door opened on a shallow recess. Inside, a single object, a slim packet wrapped in dark red Morocco leather and tied with black silk ribbon and pressed with a wax seal, unbroken. The seal bore the arms of Marsden, a stag under an oak, and the initials WHM, William Harcourt, Marsden, her father's private seal. Philippa's hands did not shake now. They had steadied at the sight of his mark. She untied the ribbon. She lifted the seal without breaking it, easing the wax free with the point of her thumbnail, as her father had taught her when she was 10, so that a document might be read and reclosed, and no one the wiser. Inside the Morocco lay a single document folded in 3, and pinned to it a shorter note in her father's hand. She unfolded the document first. It was written on parchment. It had been drawn up in Lichfield in the summer of 1816, 6 months before her father died. It was headed "A Codicil to the Last Will and Testament of William Harcourt, 4th Duke of Marsden." It was witnessed by Ambrose Pennington, solicitor, and by 2 clerks whose signatures she did not know. She read it once. She read it again, slowly, the way her father had taught her to read anything of consequence. To his beloved daughter Philippa Ann Harcourt, in absolute possession and free of any encumbrance her stepmother might attempt to lay against her, the sum of £30,000 held in the 3%. The manor of Ashfield in Warwickshire, together with all its rents and lands, the dower house at Marsden and its gardens, and the 2 farms of Redwell and Cornbrook. And, in the event that Philippa should be a minor, or should be in any way constrained by her father's widow, the Duchess Cressida, an executor was named to see the codicil discharged and Philippa free. Marcus Ashley, Duke of Bramwell, presently upon service in the Peninsula, godson to the late Duke, trusted above all men. Philippa set the parchment down on the writing table. She lifted the note pinned to it. Her father's hand had been small and neat, and it had gone spidery in the last months of his life. This had been written when it was still firm. My dear child, if you read this, then Cressida has done what I feared. Trust Pennington. Trust Bramwell when he comes. Do not confront her. She will only lie the harder. Endure until you are heard. You are your mother's daughter, and mine, and neither of us bred you to break. Philippa read the note twice. Then she folded it. She folded the codicil. She wrapped both again in the morocco. She retied the black silk. She pressed the seal back into its own soft impression with the flat of her palm, and it held, because good wax was made to hold. She stood a long moment with the packet in her hand. The house was quiet. She thought of Norfolk. She thought of a cell and a bell and a life spent between them. She thought of Lady Ashley's letter turning blue and black in the drawing-room fire. She thought of her father, in this chair, in this room, writing £30,000 against the day he could no longer defend her. She thought of the name Bramwell, whom she had never met, who was a stranger, who was in the peninsula, who might be dead, who might be honorable, who might be neither. She put the packet inside the front of her dress, beneath the cameo, beneath the mended stays, against her ribs where it warmed to her skin. She replaced Blackstone on its shelf. She closed the small brass door. She locked it. She took the key. She blew out the candle. She stood in the dark and made herself count to 50. Then she opened the cabinet door. The passage was still empty. The porter still snored. She retraced her way along the paneling, over the loose board, up the gallery stair, along the north corridor, past the linen press where a bar of light showed under the door and meant that Mrs. Burskoff was awake and waiting, listening for a step that either came or did not come. Philippa did not stop. She did not signal. Any signal would be a risk. She reached her own door. She closed it. She turned the little brass bolt. She went to the escritoire. There, in the second drawer, wrapped in an old kerchief, lay a square of puce velvet she had cut from the ruined lining of her mother's traveling cloak. She had never known what she was keeping it for. She took the codicil out from the front of her dress. She wrapped it in the puce velvet, folding the cloth twice and once again so that the packet lay flat and small. She tied it with a length of common brown thread. She set it inside the hollow of the wooden workbox where her needles lived, and she covered it with the tray of pins, and she closed the box. Then, at last, she sat down. She did not go to bed. She sat by the dead grate in her mended day dress with the cameo cold against her breastbone, where the codicil had lain a moment before, and she watched the black square of the window turn slowly, slowly gray. Somewhere in the house a clock struck 4. Somewhere on the road from Lichfield, in a coaching inn where the ostler was already coaxing life into a kitchen fire, a lawyer named Pennington was writing a letter he would not sign in his own name. And somewhere on the road out of Portsmouth, a lean man of 31, with a stiff right leg and an old greatcoat of bottle green wool, was giving orders to a groom about a horse that would carry him north. Philippa did not know that yet. She knew only that the paper against her ribs had said Bramwell, and Bramwell when he comes, and she understood, with the small, hard clarity that came to her in the coldest hours, that a promise made in a dying man's hand was still a promise, and that in 3 days a coach would come, and that between now and then she would have to be more careful than she had ever been in her life. The frost on the pane began to shine. She lifted her chin. She was 22, and she had been forgotten for 3 winters, and she had, tonight, come into possession of £30,000 and a name. She did not smile. She was not yet in a position to smile. But when she stood and shook out her skirts and went to the basin to wash her face, the water that met her hands was cold enough to bite, and she welcomed the bite, because it was proof that she was still awake, and still herself, and still, for one more morning at least, the daughter her father had believed her to be. The house began, slowly, to stir below her. Somewhere down in the yellow drawing-room, Cressida Harcourt was already awake, and drinking her chocolate, and considering how best to hurry a certain journey to Norfolk. She did not yet know that the girl upstairs, in a faded puce dress with a needle in her hand, was no longer only a girl. She was a codicil, and she was walking. The corridor of the north wing lay in a cold blue hush, and Philippa moved through it in her stockinged feet, the borrowed key warm against her palm because she had been holding it for 2 hours without daring to set it down. A single tallow candle burned in her other hand. The flame guttered whenever she passed a shuttered window, and she had counted 6 of them between her own door and the black oak door of the late Duke's private study. She had waited until the great clock in the hall struck 3. Cressida took laudanum with her chocolate at 10. Renshaw drank at the Buck's Head until midnight and slept in the stable loft. Mrs. Burskoff would be in the kitchen banking the fire against the frost, and Mrs. Burskoff, at any rate, would look the other way. Philippa had rehearsed the map of the house in her mind, until the map felt more solid than the walls. At the study door she stopped and listened. Nothing. Only the wind under the eaves and, somewhere far below, the faint chink of a poker in ashes. She fitted the key. It turned with a small, offended click, as though the lock resented being woken after 2 years, and then the door gave and she was inside. The air struck her first. Cold, old paper, the ghost of pipe tobacco. She had not stood in this room since the morning her father had taken her hand in this very spot and told her, quite calmly, that he was dying. She set the candle on the desk and did not allow herself to look at the leather chair. Instead, she looked at the shelves. They ran floor to ceiling on 3 walls, and every book on them her father had bought himself. Rows of Latin, rows of law, a soft brown gap where his Herodotus had lived before Cressida sold it. Philippa moved along the west wall, holding the candle low, reading the spines the way she had been taught to read them. Blackstone. He had said Blackstone. Pennington's whisper in the sewing room had been very quiet and very exact. Behind the 4th volume of Blackstone, on the west wall, at the height of a man's shoulder. She found the commentaries in the second bay, 4 calf-bound volumes, gold-tooled, dulled by neglect. She counted along. 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th. The 4th volume did not sit flush with the others. It sat forward by the width of a finger. Philippa set the candle on the small library table and lifted the book down with both hands. It was heavier than she remembered from her father's lessons, and she laid it open-faced on the table as though it might scold her. Then she looked into the gap it had left. At the back of the shelf, where deep dust ought to have been, there was instead a small brass ring, no larger than a wedding band, set flush into the wood. She stared at it for the space of 2 breaths. Then she took the ring between finger and thumb and pulled. A panel came away in her hand, a slip of cedar, 4 inches by 6, so cleanly fitted she would never have seen its seam in daylight. Behind it lay a hollow lined with green baize, and in the hollow, wrapped in a square of oiled silk, sat a single folded document. She lifted it out. The seal was black wax, unbroken. Stamped into it was the Marsden crest, the greyhound courant she had loved as a child, the one she had traced onto the flyleaf of every book her father had given her. She held the packet close to the candle. Her hands were quite steady. She had expected them to shake, and was faintly surprised that they did not. She broke the seal with her thumbnail. The paper opened in 3 folds. It was heavy-laid stock, the kind Pennington sold in Chancery Lane for legal work, and the ink was the dense iron black of a document meant to survive. At the top, in a clerk's careful copperplate, ran the heading she had half expected and yet, seeing it, could not quite believe. A codicil to the last will and testament of Edmund Alaric Harcourt, 9th Duke of Marsden, executed this 12th day of April, in the year of our Lord 1816. She read the first paragraph, and then she read it again, because the first time the words had slid off her mind like water off oiled silk. Whereas since the execution of my last will, I have had cause to reconsider the provision made for my only child, Philippa Ann Harcourt, and whereas I have satisfied myself that certain influences within my household have not the interest of my said daughter at heart, I hereby amend and augment the said will as follows. The candle flickered. Philippa moved her body between it and the door, though the door was shut. First, I bequeath to my daughter Philippa the sum of £30,000 sterling, drawn upon the 3% held in my name at Coutts, the same to be settled upon her absolutely at the age of 21, or upon her marriage, whichever event shall the sooner occur. £30,000. She had turned 22 in August. The sum sat on the page like a stone dropped into a still pond, and the rings of it went outward through her without noise. Second, I devise and bequeath to my said daughter the freehold of Withington Grange, in the county of Warwickshire, together with all farms, tenants, chattels, and appurtenances thereunto belonging, being the property brought into my possession by her late mother, Anne Harcourt, born Withington, the same being her mother's portion and by right descending to her issue. Her mother's house, the little brick manor with the walled garden where Philippa had been born, where she had picked greengages barefoot with her mother the summer before the fever, and which Cressida had, 3 months after the funeral, informed her had been sold for the widow's jointure. Philippa put a hand flat on the table. She read on. Third, I devise and bequeath to my said daughter the freehold of the London house at number 14, Half Moon Street, Mayfair, together with all furniture and effects, my beloved Anne having so wished. Half Moon Street. She had walked past that door as a small girl, holding her father's gloved hand, and had watched the brass knocker being polished by a boy in a striped apron. Cressida had told her that house belonged now to the dowager. Cressida had, for 2 winters, hosted her card parties there. The next paragraph was the one that Pennington, in the sewing room, had wet his lips before speaking of. Fourth, and being resolved that the execution of this codicil shall not fall into the hands of my present wife, Cressida Harcourt, Duchess of Marsden, whose disposition toward my daughter I have of late come to distrust, I hereby appoint as sole executor of this instrument His Grace Marcus Alexander Ashley, Duke of Bramwell, in whose honor and in whose old regard for my house I place my confidence, and I direct that no disposition of the said moneys or properties be made, save under his hand and seal. Marcus Alexander Ashley, Duke of Bramwell. She had never met him. She had heard his name at her father's table when she was 15 years old. Corunna, a wound in the leg, a duke's son who fought as a captain of light dragoons because his father would not buy him a colonelcy. Her father had said that boy has iron in him, and Cressida had made a sour face over her soup. Philippa refolded the codicil along its creases. She did it slowly, because if she did it quickly, she would tear it. She stood alone in her father's cold study, with a document worth £30,000 in her hands, and she felt, for the first time in 2 years, that she was inside her own body. She heard, then, a sound. A door, 3 rooms distant, a soft closing. Philippa blew out the candle. She stood in absolute darkness with the codicil pressed against her breastbone, and she counted her breaths. 1, 2, 3, 4. No further sound, only the wind and the old house settling around her ribs. At 6 she moved. She had memorized the room in daylight in girlhood, and the memory served her now. She slid the codicil inside the bodice of her nightgown, under the shawl, where the paper crackled once against her skin, and then lay still. She fitted the cedar panel back into its recess, felt with her fingertip that the brass ring lay flush. She replaced the 4th volume of Blackstone. She pushed it forward the exact width of her finger, the way she had found it, because a woman who noticed such things had once put it just so. She took up the cold candle and went to the door. In the corridor she stood a long moment listening. She heard, at the far end of the north wing, the creak of a floorboard. Then nothing. A servant, perhaps, on some cold errand of their own. She locked the study door behind her and dropped the key into the small pocket sewn inside her shawl, where Pennington had told her to keep it until she could put it back into his hand. She went the long way back to her room, through the disused sewing gallery, because if anyone were awake in the main corridor, she did not wish to explain wet feet. Once in her own chamber, she bolted the door and stood with her back against it. She permitted herself, then, one small, unguarded thing. She let her head tip back against the oak, and she closed her eyes, and she said, under her breath and to no one, "Papa." She said it once. She did not say it again. Then she moved. Her mother's workbox stood on the deal table by the window. It was a battered walnut affair with a tarnished silver clasp, and it was the last object in the house that Cressida had never coveted, because Cressida did not sew. Philippa opened it. Inside, folded small and pressed flat between 2 squares of tissue, lay a scrap of faded puce velvet, the last piece cut from a gown her mother had worn to a Christmas ball at Withington. Philippa had kept it as a child because it smelled of orris. It smelled of orris still. She unfolded it on the table. She laid the codicil upon it. She folded the velvet around the paper as one might wrap a christening gift, corner to corner, and tied it with a length of narrow ivory ribbon from her mother's own reel. When it was done, the parcel was smaller than her palm and soft as a mouse in the hand. She lifted the loose board beneath the head of her narrow bed, the one she had discovered at 12 years old and used, in those innocent years, to hide a copy of The Mysteries of Udolpho she had been forbidden to read. Beneath it lay the shallow cavity between joist and lath. She laid the velvet parcel in it. She replaced the board. She dragged the corner of the bedstead half an inch back over the seam. Then she washed her hands in the ewer and, because she was practical, and because her hands were shaking now that the work was done, she drank the water that remained in the cup. She sat on the edge of the bed. She did not lie down. Outside the window, the last of the November stars were paling toward gray. In 2 hours, Sarah would come with the fire and find her already dressed and mending, and Sarah would not be surprised, because Sarah had for months found her already dressed and mending. Philippa sat, and she thought, and she did not weep, because tears were a luxury she had rationed since she was 20. £30,000, Withington Grange, Half Moon Street, and a man she had never seen who held the seal upon all three. The convent in Norfolk was to be tomorrow. If she reached the convent, the codicil would remain under her bed, and Cressida would find it within a week, and Cressida would burn it, and the greyhound Courant would go into the fire with her father's name. Philippa knew this the way she knew the pattern of the crack in her ceiling. There was no room in her chest for the flattering thought that she might be wrong. She had, then, to get word to Bramwell. She did not know where Bramwell was. She did not know his hand, or his face, or whether the old regard for her house that her father had trusted still lived in him after 8 years of war and 8 years of silence. She knew only that Pennington had, in the sewing room, murmured that the Duke of Bramwell had come north in October and was thought to be at his seat in Staffordshire for the winter. Staffordshire, 60 miles. She could not go to Staffordshire. She would be in a chaise to Norfolk by noon. A letter, then. But a letter sent from Marsden Hall passed through Cressida's hands. The morning post bag was locked in the still room, and the key hung from Cressida's own chatelaine, and Cressida read every seal. Philippa sat very straight and set her mind, as her mother had taught her, to the shape of the problem. There was one letter that Cressida did not read. Once a week Mrs. Burskoff sent a note down to her sister in Uttoxeter, who was married to a baker there, on the plain domestic business of receipts and rheumatics. The note went in the housekeeper's own basket with the Uttoxeter carrier at dawn every Wednesday, and Cressida did not open Mrs. Burskoff's letters because Cressida had, 2 summers ago, opened one and found a recipe for pig's trotters, and had thereafter considered Mrs. Burskoff beneath her interest. Tomorrow was Wednesday. Philippa slid from the bed and crossed to her writing case. It was a thin mahogany box her father had given her at 15. Inside lay a single quill, an inkwell 3/4 spent, 6 sheets of hot-pressed paper, and the small brass seal her mother had used, which bore no crest but only the initials A, Atch, within a wreath. She trimmed the quill. She uncorked the ink. She wrote in a small, even hand, without preamble. Your Grace, I am the only child of the late Duke of Marsden, whom you had the goodness to esteem. I have this night found, in the place my father intended it to be found, a codicil to his will, dated April 1816, which names your Grace as sole executor, and which restores to me a portion my present guardian believes to have been extinguished. I am to be sent tomorrow at noon to a religious house in Norfolk, from which I do not expect to return in a condition to answer any letter. The document itself I have concealed in this house. I entreat you, if any part of my father's memory has weight with you, to come to Marsden Hall at the earliest hour possible, and to bring with you Mr. Ambrose Pennington of Chancery Lane, whose hand is upon this business. Trust no seal from this house that is not marked with the letters A, H within a wreath. I sign myself with the name my mother gave me, Philippa Ann Harcourt. She read it twice. She struck out no word. She folded the sheet in 3, dropped a wafer of red wax upon the fold, and pressed her mother's brass seal into it. A.H. within a wreath. She addressed the outside in a copyist's hand her father had made her practice as a child, so that no examining eye would call it a lady's writing. To His Grace the Duke of Bramwell, Bramwell Park, by Lichfield, Staffordshire, by favour of Mrs. E. Wetherall, Uttoxeter, to be forwarded. The name Wetherall was Mrs. Burskoff's sister's name. Philippa had heard it spoken once, in her hearing, in a corridor. She had kept it because she kept everything. She wrapped the letter in a second sheet, so that its seal should not show through, and slipped it inside the bosom of her nightgown, where the codicil had lately been. Her heart beat against the paper twice for every stroke of the mantel clock. She would go down to the kitchen at 4:30. She would take the back stair. Mrs. Burskoff would be there, banking the fire against the frost, as she was every night of her life. Philippa would ask for a cup of hot water. She had asked for it before, on cold nights, and been given it without comment. And while Mrs. Burskoff drew the water, Philippa would drop the letter into the covered basket that stood by the door for the Duchess carrier. If Mrs. Burskoff saw, Mrs. Burskoff would know what to do, because Mrs. Burskoff had once, in Philippa's 10th year, spread a napkin over a piece of gingerbread the child had smuggled from the nursery and told cook to look the other way. The clock struck 4. Philippa put on her shawl and her stockings and her worn slippers, and she took up an empty tin cup from her washstand, and she went down. The back stair was steep and unlit, and she went down it by memory. At the bottom the kitchen door stood ajar, and warm red light lay in a bar along the flagstones, and she could hear the small, deliberate sound of a poker being set into its stand. She pushed the door. Mrs. Burskoff stood at the range in her black bombazine and her spotless apron. She was banking the fire. She did not turn at once. She said, quite calmly, without looking up, "You are up early, Miss Philippa." "I could not sleep," Philippa said. "I came for hot water." "The kettle is on. Sit down." Philippa did not sit. She set the tin cup on the deal table by the door. The covered basket for the Duchess carrier stood on the settle beside it. A clean napkin spread across its mouth. Mrs. Burskoff was still at the range. Philippa lifted the corner of the napkin. She dropped the letter in. The napkin fell back. Mrs. Burskoff turned then, wiping her hands on her apron, and crossed to the kettle, and lifted it, and poured the steaming water into the tin cup without spilling one drop. She looked, once, in passing, at the basket. Her face did not change. "There," she said. "Drink it slow. It's a cold morning." "Thank you, Mrs. Burskoff." "Miss Philippa," the housekeeper's voice was low and even. She was pouring a second measure of water into a china cup for herself, and she did not raise her eyes from the pouring. "My sister writes me every Wednesday from Duchess. She has a boy of 14 who is quick on a horse and honest. He rides for the Lichfield mail on Fridays. If a letter of mine were to want carrying further than Duchess this week, it would be carried." Philippa's hand closed around the warm tin. "That is a great kindness in your sister," she said, "and in your sister's boy." "It is a great kindness in nobody," Mrs. Burskoff said. "It is the way things are done in a decent house. Your father, God rest him, kept a decent house." She set down the kettle. She looked, for the first time, full at Philippa. Her eyes were the wet brown of a hazelnut, and there was nothing sentimental in them. "You are to go to Norfolk at noon," she said. "Yes. I sewed a linen band inside the hem of your gray traveling cloak this morning. If there is anything small and flat you would rather not lose on the road, it may travel in that band, and Cressida will not think to look inside a hem. You understand me." "I understand you. Drink your water, Miss Philippa. It grows cold." Philippa drank. The water scalded her tongue and she was grateful for it, because it gave her something to do with her face. She said, when the cup was half empty, "Mrs. Burskoff." "Miss, you have been very good." "I have not been very good," Mrs. Burskoff said. "I have been very late. Your mother has been in her grave 16 years and your father too, and I should have spoken up before now. Go back to bed. The house will wake in an hour." Philippa went back to bed. She lay upon the coverlet in her shawl, and she did not sleep. She listened to the house begin to move around her. The first tread of a kitchen maid on the stone stair, the clank of the iron latch at the scullery door, the distant creak of the yard gate as the Duchess carrier's cart rolled in under the arch. She heard at 5:15 the small, unhurried sound of Mrs. Burskoff carrying the covered basket across the yard, and she heard the carrier's dry greeting, and she heard the wheels move out again under the arch and away. She closed her eyes then, but she did not sleep. She listened to her own heartbeat, and she counted the miles between Duchess and Lichfield and Bramwell Park, and she calculated coldly, in the way her father had taught her to calculate, that if the boy rode on Friday, the letter would be in the Duke of Bramwell's hand by Friday evening, and Norfolk was 3 days from Marsden Hall, and the Mother Superior of a Norfolk convent could keep a novice alive on gruel for a very long time. She had bought herself a week, perhaps 2. At 7:30 Sarah came with the fire, and found her, as expected, already dressed and combing her hair. The morning proceeded as such mornings did. Cressida did not come down. Her woman carried up a tray. Philippa took chocolate alone in the small parlor with the crack in the ceiling. At 10 o'clock she was summoned to the Duchess's dressing room, where Cressida, half-dressed and pale with laudanum, informed her without turning from the glass that the carriage would be at the door at noon, that she should pack only what fitted in a single valise, and that any correspondence she wished to send from the religious house was to pass through the hand of the Mother Superior for the Duchess's approval. "Yes, madam," Philippa said. "You will not," Cressida said, "make a scene at parting." "No, madam." "There is nothing," Cressida said, "in this house that is yours." Philippa held her hands still at her sides. Beneath the third floorboard from the head of her narrow bed, wrapped in a scrap of faded puce velvet tied with an ivory ribbon, 30,000 pounds and 2 houses and 1 man's honor, lay quiet as a sleeping cat. In the hem of the gray cloak that lay folded across her valise, a small linen band waited to receive them. "No, madam," she said. Cressida turned from the glass. She looked at Philippa with the cold, assessing look of a woman appraising a piece of furniture for sale, and her light green eyes moved once over the faded puce gown, and once over the still hands, and once over the composed mouth, and she said, quite softly, "You are your father's daughter." "Yes, madam." "That will pass," Cressida said, and turned back to the glass. "Norfolk is a great cure for such likenesses. You may go." Philippa went. She walked down the north corridor with her back straight and her hands folded at her waist, and she passed the black oak door of her father's study without looking at it, and she thought, quite clearly and without any tremor of self-pity, by Friday the letter will be in Staffordshire. By Sunday he will read it. By Monday he will be on the road. She reached her own chamber. She closed the door. She did not lock it, because a locked door in this house at this hour would be reported before the clock next struck. She crossed to the narrow bed. She knelt. She lifted the loose board. She took out the velvet parcel. She held it a moment in her cupped palms as though it were a bird. Then she slid it into the linen band Mrs. Burskoff had sewn inside the hem of the gray cloak, and she smoothed the wool flat with the edge of her hand until no line showed at all. She stood. She lifted her valise. She heard, out in the drive, the small, clean sound of harness bells as Renshaw brought the traveling chaise around under the porte-cochere. Philippa Ann Harcourt straightened her cuffs. She lifted her chin, the exact quarter-inch her mother had taught her. She walked out of her father's house with 30,000 pounds in the hem of her cloak and a duke she had never met riding, though she did not yet know it, toward her from 60 miles away. The chaise door stood open. Renshaw touched his hat and would not meet her eye. Cressida watched from the top step in her cinder-gray mantle and did not descend. Philippa set her foot upon the step. At Bramwell Park, 60 miles to the southwest, a hard rain was already falling on the roof of a stable where a black horse stood saddled, and a man with a slight limp and a cold cup of coffee was breaking the seal of a letter forwarded that morning from a Toxeter, and reading, for the second time, the words, "The name my mother gave me." Marcus read the line a third time before he set the letter down on the ink-stained blotter. "The name my mother gave me." 7 words, and a signature he had last seen at the bottom of a promise made in a farmhouse outside Corunna, when a dying man had gripped his wrist and asked him to look after a daughter he had never been permitted to raise. The coffee had gone entirely cold. He did not notice. Outside the window of the posting inn at Uttoxeter, the November light lay flat across the yard, and a boy was leading his bay gelding out of the stall, breath steaming. Marcus rose. The old wound in his right thigh answered him with its usual protest, and he set his weight on the ebony cane a moment longer than pride approved of. "Boots and horse in 10 minutes, he said to the innkeeper. "I ride for Marsden Hall." He wrote 2 letters before he left. The first, in a small hand, was to Mr. Ambrose Pennington, solicitor, chambers at Gray's Inn. "Come at once to the Swan at Lichfield. Bring everything you have kept for me." The second was to his sister at Bramwell Park, 3 lines only, and it ended, "Do not answer letters that are not in my hand." He sealed both with the double horses of Bramwell and paid the boy 6pence for a fast rider. By the time the church bells were striking 11, the greatcoat of dark green merino was buttoned to his throat, and he had turned the gelding onto the Ashbourne road. He rode the way a man rides who has learned to save a horse over distance. The country came up around him in browns and rust and the gray of exposed stone. He did not push, he thought. He had known the late Duke of Marsden the way a young officer knows an older one, from a distance that becomes intimate under fire. In the smoke above the Elvina Ridge, the Duke had refused a surgeon and dictated instead 3 long minutes of instructions concerning a codicil, a solicitor's name, a girl in Staffordshire, with a scar on the back of her left hand. Marcus had written it down on the flap of a cartridge box. He had promised. He had come home to Bramwell to bury a father and a mother in one winter, and then to the slow work of a leg that would never again be quite what it was, and he had let the promise ripen too long in a drawer. He had allowed himself the excuse of a stranger's household. The letter in his breast pocket had ended that excuse. He arrived at Marsden Hall an hour before dusk. The gates were open, as gates are open when no one expects a person of consequence. A boy in a stained apron took the gelding, and Marcus climbed the front steps under a pediment whose plaster had begun to shed like an old skin. He struck the brass knocker once. The door opened, and a footman in a livery 2 sizes too large stared at him with the frank astonishment of a household unused to callers. "Bramwell," Marcus said, "executor to the late Duke. I am expected." He was not, in fact, expected. He watched the word Bramwell travel through the footman's face, and then, after a delay in which someone somewhere had clearly been consulted, he was ushered into a hall whose black and white marble had been scrubbed thin. Mrs. Burskoff was already at the foot of the great staircase, hands clasped over her impeccable white apron. Her eyes met his without any of the deference he had been prepared to endure. What passed between them was so brief the footman missed it. It was the look of a person who has been waiting a great deal longer than the caller. "Her Grace will receive you in the drawing-room, Your Grace," Mrs. Burskoff said, and her voice was flat and correct. She turned, and as she led him past a console table on which a single tallow candle guttered in a silver stick that ought to have held wax, she said, without turning her head, and quite softly, "His late Grace kept his Blackstone in the study, sir, on the north wall." Then she opened a set of double doors and announced him. Cressida rose from the sofa as if he had caught her mid-prayer. She was in the second stage of mourning still, the half-lavender crepe, the jet brooch with its plait of the dead man's hair, the little cap that suggested widowhood without entombing her in it. She had arranged herself with the tea things in front of her, a book of sermons open, a fire that was rather too large for the size of the room. Duke of Bramwell. She dropped a curtsy of precisely the depth owed to his rank. "You honor a house of grief. Your Grace." Marcus inclined his head, no lower. "I ride from London on business your husband made mine. Please, sit." He sat. He allowed her to pour. He watched her hand as she did so, and noted, without changing his expression, that the ring on her third finger was not quite the ring the late Duke had described in the field hospital. That ring had been a sapphire ringed with brilliance. This was a sapphire, but the setting was newer and lighter, and the stone considerably smaller. "You knew my husband abroad, I understand," she said. She sat. She lifted her cup. Her gloves stayed on. "I served under him at Corunna. He gave me instructions there, which I have not, until this month, been able to attend." "Ah!" A very small pause. "Instructions. Concerning his daughter." She set the cup back into its saucer with a click so precise it was almost musical. "Miss Harcourt." Cressida's mouth shaped the name as one shapes a duty. "Poor Philippa. She is a great trial to us, Your Grace. My late husband, in his final months, was, how shall I put it, no longer entirely mindful. He had grown fond of promises he could not keep. He kept the ones I heard. He was very ill," she smiled. It was a precise, elegant lie. He was, at the end, so afraid of leaving her without portion that he spoke of settlements he could not afford. "Marsden, Your Grace, is a house of debts. My husband was generous to a fault. There was no fortune to settle. And yet," Marcus set down the cup she had filled and had no intention of drinking. "There was a will. There was a will. May I see it?" Her hand went, unbidden, to the jet at her throat. "It is with our solicitor, Mr. Elias Tracy, of Fetter Lane." Everything was quite proper. Everything was, of course, witnessed. It leaves the entirety of the estate to the widow, as is customary in cases of debt, so that the widow might discharge the burdens with which the daughter should never be troubled. How thoughtful. "Motherhood is a shield, Your Grace. You are not her mother, madam." The smile did not falter, but the mouth beneath it went white for an instant at the corners. "I have been in the office of one for 9 years. Then you will not object if my own solicitor examines Mr. Tracy's document. I have written to him. He is on his way. He is Mr. Ambrose Pennington. You will have heard the name." She had. He watched her hear it. Pennington had drawn the marriage settlement of the late Duke's first wife, 30 years before. Pennington had drawn every serious paper of the Marsden family in living memory. Pennington was a name that did not sit down at a table with Elias Tracy. "I shall be delighted," Cressida said, "to place the matter before Mr. Pennington. Everything is in order." "Splendid." He set his cup aside with the finality of a man ending a first engagement, and he did what he had come to do, which was to ask, quite mildly, "Is Miss Harcourt within the house?" "She is indisposed." "Since when?" "Since last night, a slight fever. She has taken to her rooms. I should like to convey to her, when she is recovered, my late friend's regard. I shall convey it for you." "I am sure you will." He rose. The knee complained. He did not let it show. "Your Grace, I shall not impose upon your hospitality tonight. I ride to Lichfield. I shall return in 3 days with Mr. Pennington." 3 days? 3. She stood also. In the last of the light through the north window, her cheekbones cast long shadows down her face, and for the space of a breath he saw the woman under the widow, the sharpness under the crape. "Duke of Bramwell," she said, "it is a kindness in you to trouble yourself for a girl who was, forgive me, not born to expect it." "She was born," Marcus said, "to a man to whom I owe a debt." He bowed. He left. Mrs. Burskoff walked him to the great door with her ring of iron keys at her waist, chiming softly with each step. In the vestibule, out of sight of the drawing-room, she pressed a folded slip of paper into his glove. "The north study, sir," she murmured. "The panel behind the Blackstone. He always did trust books more than men." He glanced down. Her rough red hand had already withdrawn. "How is she?" he asked, without looking up. "Alive? Guarded? By me, when I can. By the mistress, when she cannot. Does she know I have come?" "I shall see that she knows before dawn, sir. There is a maid who will carry a word into the sewing basket. Tell her," he paused, "tell her a promise made at Corunna has come north. Tell her nothing more than that." "Yes, your Grace." He mounted at the block, and he rode. He did not go far. 3 miles down the Ashbourne Road, he turned the gelding into a lane he had marked earlier, and doubled back through a beech wood at a hunter's pace, and he came upon Marsden Hall from behind an hour after full dark. He tied his horse in the shelter of an ice-house, and walked the last stretch through the wet grass with his cane held under his arm. The window of the north study was not lit. He had counted on that. The study had not been used since a coffin left the house. He picked the sash with the point of his knife and eased himself inside. The room smelt of cold ash and old leather. He took the risk of a small dark lantern he had brought from the inn, and by its shielded thread of light, he found what Mrs. Burskoff had told him he would find: the Blackstone, 4 heavy quartos, on the north wall, spines faded to slate. He put his gloved fingers behind the 3rd volume. The board behind it moved a 1/4 of an inch, then stopped. Something had already disturbed it. He crouched. He set the lantern on the boards. In the gap behind the Blackstone, the wood had been forced, gently, and quite recently, and a small square of dust had been swept clean by the passage of a hand. He allowed himself, for the first time that day, a private and interior smile. Someone had been here before him, someone small, someone who had known where to look. He put the volumes back, precisely, 1 finger of dust restored to each spine from the sill. He closed the panel. He left the study as he had found it, and he was out through the sash and away over the wet grass and up onto his horse before the stable clock had struck the 1/4. He rode through the night. He did not ride at speed. He had a cane and a knee and 30 miles to Lichfield and no wish to make a spectacle, but he rode with the settled steadiness of a man to whom the shape of an enemy has become visible. She had counted on the study standing untouched. She had not counted on the girl going in first. The girl had gone in, and the girl had taken away whatever was there. The whole of the widow's air, in the drawing-room, had been the air of a woman playing for time she did not know she had already lost. He reached the Swan at Lichfield a little after dawn. He slept 2 hours in his boots on a settle by the fire. He was drinking hot chocolate in the private parlor when Mr. Ambrose Pennington came in on the London coach, brushed with the dust of 80 miles, carrying a leather case that had been mended so many times it looked like a map of the man's life. "Your Grace, Pennington, sit down, eat." Then talk. The solicitor sat. He did not eat. He opened the case. You have news, Marcus said. I have, Pennington said. 2 envelopes and an account book. He set the first envelope on the table. Its wax was dark red and had been broken and resealed with a lump of common wafer. That, Your Grace, is the codicil executed by His late Grace in the spring of 1816. I drew it. I witnessed it. It was placed by his own hand behind a certain book in the North Study, at his instruction. It settles £30,000 and the tenancies at Ashwell and Littlecombe upon Miss Philippa Harcourt on her 23rd birthday, or upon her marriage, whichever should first fall, and it names Your Grace as executor, to act in the event of any dispute with the widow. I have not opened it. I have kept only the wafer. It is my copy of my own drafting, on the same paper. That is a comfort a man in my position permits himself. He set the second envelope beside it. This, Your Grace, is the will presented at Doctors' Commons by Mr. Elias Tracy on the 14th of March last. It leaves the estate absolute to the widow. It bears His late Grace's signature. It bears mine. Neither is genuine. Marcus looked up, slowly. Your name is on a forgery. My name is on a piece of paper with which I had no traffic whatever. Mr. Tracy has been very industrious. He has not been careful. He has spelt Pennington with 1 N in the second syllable, as any clerk of his standing would. I have never used but the one. Pennington set beside the 2 envelopes a small buff account book bound in string. This, he said, I obtained through the good offices of a lender in Aldersgate, whose son I once kept from the gallows. Her Grace of Marsden has, in the last 11 months, borrowed against every unentailed asset of the estate, plate, linen, 2 farms at Ashwell that she does not, in law, possess. And this, Your Grace, which will be of some interest to you. He turned the page. He set his fingernail beneath a line of ink. On the 7th of September, the Marsden Parure of Sapphires was pledged for £4,500 to a Mr. Ezekiel Vane of Duke Street. The paradere remains at Mr. Vane's uncollected. His usual practice, upon default, is to break the stones from their settings and sell them separately by Christmas. Marcus laid one finger on the page and did not lift it for some time. The paradere, he said, is the child's. By codicil, yes. And the child does not know. The child, I suspect, knows a great deal more than she has been permitted to say, but she does not know that, no. Marcus drew breath. He let it out. He put his hand into his pocket and drew forth the folded letter from Uddoxeter that had reached him yesterday. She wrote to me last night, Pennington. Under a false direction. Under her own hand. She used a phrase her father used to me once, in the field. She asked me to come. She said, and I quote, that she has in her keeping a thing her father hid before he died, and that she cannot keep it much longer, because the household is being closed, and she is being sent to a house of religious retirement in Norfolk within the week. That is what the letter said. Then, Your Grace, we have no time. No. May I ask what you intend? Marcus stood. The knee took him with more gentleness than usual, as if it had understood the day. I intend to buy every debt of Cressida Harcourt within the hour. I intend to purchase the Marsden Parure out of Vane's strong room before Sunday. I intend to lay Mr. Elias Tracy's forgery before the Court of Chancery on the earliest sitting day, and then, Pennington, I intend to remove the girl from that house. By what authority? By that of a codicil, which names me her guardian in event of hostile widowhood. That codicil, Your Grace, is at present in the personal keeping of a young woman inside a house of unfriendly persons. Then I intend to be there when she brings it out. Pennington closed his eyes for a moment, in the way of an old man permitting himself an emotion. Your late friend, he said, chose his executor well. My late friend chose me because I was cheap and near at hand, and because he trusted the promise of a captain more than the will of any solicitor whose name he could not remember. Sit. Eat. Write. I want a letter under your hand to Mr. Vane. I want a bank draft on Coots. I want a private word with the sheriff of this county before dinner. And I want Miss Ashley of Bramwell brought here by carriage before Friday. Your sister, Your Grace? My sister has been in correspondence with a young woman in Staffordshire for the better part of 3 years. That correspondence has, I have very lately learned, run through the person of Mrs. Burskoff, housekeeper at Marsden Hall. I should like to know what my sister knows. Pennington bowed his white head. "It shall be done, Your Grace." Marcus rode back to Bramwell Park that afternoon, and he was in his sister's morning room before the tea had cooled. May was in her chair by the fire, in her white muslin, the cowper closed under her thin hand, the tartan rug across her knees. She looked up at him, and she saw at once, in the way sick people always see, that he had come home changed. "Marcus," she said, "you have that face?" "Which face?" "The one you had at Corunna, when you were about to do something you would not tell me about for a year." He crossed the room and sat on the low stool by her chair, and he took her small, cold hand between his gloved ones. "May," he said, "tell me about Philippa Harcourt." She did not startle. She looked at him a long moment. Then she looked into the fire. "You know, I know she has been writing to you. I know Mrs. Burskoff has been the postboy. I know that you knew, in your quiet, cunning way, that our father's captain and her father's regard were one and the same man, and you did not tell me, because you have been waiting for me to arrive at it in my own time. May, you have not many strong afternoons. Spend this one." Her chin trembled, only for a second. She composed it. "She began writing to me the spring after her father died," May said. "Mrs. Burskoff had known Mamma, long ago, in Shropshire. Mrs. Burskoff understood that a girl in that house needed a friend that the mistress could not open, so she carried the letters out with her market list, and mine came back to her in ribbon parcels from a milliner in Uttoxeter. I have 3 years of them, Marcus. I have 3 years of the small daily courage of a person who has not, for one single day, been treated as a daughter of that house. Why did you not tell me? Because you would have gone in like a cavalry charge. Because you were half a corpse yourself the first winter. Because I did not know, until this summer, that the widow meant her real harm, and by then I had learned from Philippa that any move of yours would only make the widow move faster. And now, May's blue eyes lifted, hard as they were ever able to be. The widow has burned the last of my letters in front of her. The widow has said the word convent. The widow has closed the north study without notice, and Philippa has told me, in a note that came out folded into a sample of ribbon, that she has taken something that belonged to her father, and that she is being watched. Marcus, I have been holding her up on paper for 3 years. I cannot hold her up any longer." He kissed her hand. He did not speak for the space of a minute. "You will not have to," he said. "Bring her here." "I shall." "Marcus, there is a thing more." "Say it." May released his hand and reached, with the effort of a strong feeling and a weak body, into the little marquetry box beside her chair. She drew out a slip of paper, folded very small, sealed with a wafer stamped by a thumbprint rather than a signet. "This came to Burskoff at midnight 2 nights ago. She sent it on to me under cover of a receipt for tallow. I have read it. I think you must." Marcus took it. He read it in the firelight. "Tell your brother the widow means to send the escort within the week. The coach will go by Uttoxeter after dark. Renshaw drives. He drinks. If any man is to meet me on that road, let it be a man who once fought beside my father. What I carry cannot travel to Norfolk. I am not afraid, but I would very much rather not go alone." He looked up. His sister was watching him. "Marcus," she said softly, "what is it that she carries?" "The one thing," Marcus said, "that her father put behind a book so that a widow could never burn it." He rose. He tucked the note into his breast pocket, beside the letter from Uttoxeter, and the two touched, paper against paper, and it seemed to him for a moment that a promise made under a Spanish sky and a promise made in an English drawing room had, at last, come into the same coat. "May, I want you at the Swan at Lichfield by Friday. Pennington will send a carriage. I want you within an hour of Marsden, and I want you in a room I can bring her to. I shall be there. You should not travel. I shall travel." He bent, and he kissed her forehead where the fine hair was damp against the temple, and he did not tell her she was brave, because she had known it since she was 9. He rode out again at first light. He did not ride alone. In his saddlebag now were 3 things: a bank draft signed by his own hand on Coots for a sum that would extinguish every debt Cressida Harcourt had contracted in 11 months, a letter from Mr. Ambrose Pennington to Mr. Ezekiel Vane, releasing the Marsden sapphire parure into the custody of the bearer, against the enclosed sum in full, and a folded sheet of paper on which Marcus, in his own hand, had drafted the beginnings of a case against Elias Tracy for the forgery of a testamentary instrument. He rode east into a low, iron sky. He came into Marsden village at dusk on the third day. He did not go up to the hall. He took a private parlor at the Marsden Arms, and he sent for Mrs. Burskoff by a boy who was known to her. She came within the hour, hooded, breathing hard from the walk down the lane. He closed the door behind her himself. "Sit." "I cannot stay long, sir." Then quickly, "Where is she?" "In her rooms, watched. The mistress has taken to sitting outside her door with a book of sermons. Miss Philippa is very calm. That is what I do not like. She is very calm. She has the thing. She has it on her, sir, sewn into the lining of her small trunk, under a puce ribbon. I stitched it in myself last night with my own thimble. When does the coach go?" Mrs. Burskoff drew a long breath, as if measuring what she was permitted to say. "Tomorrow at 4 in the morning, sir, before light. Renshaw drives. The mistress will ride inside with her, to give the appearance of a family journey as far as the turnpike. From the turnpike, the mistress will take a hired chaise back to the hall, and Renshaw will carry Miss Philippa on through Udaloxeter and north to Norfolk. That is the arrangement I heard through the door of the still room. The mistress rides inside." "As far as the turnpike, sir, yes." Marcus set down the glass of ale he had not drunk. "Then she will not be a witness at a distance," he said. "She will be a witness within reach of the door handle." "Yes, sir." Mrs. Burskoff. "Sir, I want you to do one thing for me tonight. Anything. I want you to write, in your own hand, 3 words inside the lining of that trunk, where she will find them if she has need." "Yes, sir." "Write." He paused, and he looked into the fire, and he spoke as a man selecting a phrase for battle. "Write Bramwell knows. Endure." Mrs. Burskoff's throat moved. She nodded once. She rose. She went out into the wet dark of the yard and up the lane toward the hall, and Marcus sat by the fire in the small inn parlor, with his cane across his knees and the letter from Uttoxeter open on the table before him, and he watched the tallow candle burn down while he counted the miles of turnpike between Marsden village and the crossroads at Uttoxeter, and he counted them again, and he decided where he would place his horse before dawn. Somewhere in the north wing of Marsden Hall at that same hour, a young woman in a faded puce dress was sitting very still by the window of a room whose door had been locked from the outside for 2 days, and she was mending, with small even stitches, the hem of a traveling cloak she had every intention of wearing. She had received May's ribbon and its private message the night before. She knew, therefore, that a promise had come north. She did not yet know its name. She did not need to. She had spent 9 years learning to endure without knowing. She set down the needle and looked out into the dark, and in the pane's imperfect glass she saw her own reflection. A small oval face, gray eyes very wide apart, a mouth that had gone quiet the way mouths do when a decision has been taken and only the hour remains. On her lap, wrapped in a scrap of puce velvet that had once been a curtain in her mother's morning room, lay the folded weight of everything her father had thought to leave her. She did not weep, she did not pray. She took up the needle, and she sewed the last stitch of the hem, and she waited for a coach that would come for her before light. The coach did not come at first light. It came at the 9th hour, and by then Philippa had already sewn a second hem inside the first, a narrow tube of linen deep enough to hold a folded square of vellum, and she had already carried her small trunk down the servants' stair herself, because no one had been sent to carry it for her. The frost on the flagstones bit through her thin soles. Mrs. Burskoff stood at the scullery door with a hot brick wrapped in flannel, and pressed it into Philippa's hands without a word. The keys at the housekeeper's waist did not jingle. She had wound them in a strip of black bombazine to keep them silent. "Do not open the packet in the coach," Mrs. Burskoff said. "Not even to look. He will send word to Lichfield before the week is out. He may not come. He will come. Men who kneel in mud for other men's daughters do not stop at Marsden." Philippa did not ask how the housekeeper knew that Marcus had knelt beside the winter roses. She only pressed the brick tighter and stepped into the yard where Renshaw was already backing the greys into the traces, his mustard waistcoat riding high over his ribs, his eyes not lifting from the buckles. In the parlor above, Cressida watched from behind the drawn muslin. The dowager's fingers rested lightly on the lorgnette, and she counted, in a soft internal voice, the ways in which a stepdaughter might be lost between Marsden and Norfolk without any ledger recording where. What she did not say, even to herself, was that she had already written to a certain man in Uddoxeter, and that the man had already written back. The coach turned out of the yard. The gates closed. Cressida let the muslin fall. 2 days south, Marcus was already in Lichfield. He had ridden through a night of sleet with his cloak wrapped over the pommel and his signet turned inward against his palm, and he had reached the Swan a little after 4 in the morning, and he had slept on a settle by the taproom fire for 3 hours, because he did not wish to be seen taking a room under his own name. At 7 he shaved with a razor a servant fetched him. At 8 he stood at the leaded window of the private parlour above the yard and watched the pale sun bleed through Staffordshire fog. Pennington was late. This did not trouble him. Solicitors of Pennington's caste were late because they took the long streets to see who followed them. At 9:15 the door opened, and the old man came in with his hat in his hands and his spectacles fogged from the change of air. He set down a leather portfolio the color of stewed tea. He drew off his gloves finger by finger. He did not sit. "Your Grace, Mr. Pennington, I have not come alone." Marcus did not turn from the window. "Who followed you?" "No one followed me. I brought a witness. She waits in the yard with her woman." Now Marcus turned. "Lady May is in Lichfield?" "She insisted upon the journey. I could not, in conscience, prevent her, though I attempted it. Your sister, Your Grace, has been more useful to this matter than either of us has understood." Marcus crossed the small parlor in 3 strides and opened the door onto the gallery. Below, in the yard, a hired chaise stood with its steps down. A tall woman in gray held a shawl about a smaller figure whose bright hair caught what light there was. May looked up, and her face lifted as it had not lifted at Bramwell in a year, and Marcus felt the old, guarded softness inside his chest give one hard, unwelcome beat. "Bring her up," he said, "by the back stair, and send for hot chocolate and a bed warmed." They arranged May on the settle by the fire with 3 cushions and a footstool, and her woman withdrew to the passage, and only then did Pennington set his portfolio on the table between them and unlatch it. "There are 2 envelopes," he said. "I told you as much. What I did not tell you was that there is also a book." He drew out a small ledger bound in black cloth, the corners frayed, the spine cracked from being carried folded inside a coat pocket. He set it beside the envelopes and rested one ink-stained finger upon it. "The Dowager's own hand," he said. "I obtained it from a source I will not name in this room, though I will name him in Chancery when the time comes. Every farthing she has spent since your father's death is written here. Every farthing she has borrowed is written here, and she has borrowed a great deal." Marcus opened the ledger. He did not sit. He read standing, one hand flat upon the table, the other loose at his side, and the small vertical scar through his eyebrow tightened by increments as he turned the pages. Wax merchants in Chichester, a jeweler in Bath, a modiste in Bruton Street, with a bill unpaid for 18 months, a dressmaker in Norwich, a ticket at a gaming house in St. James's, under the name of a cousin, and then, 6 pages in, a single line in a firmer, blacker ink than the rest. "Pledged, upon receipt of the sum of 2,300, the Marsden Parsury complete, to Mr. Cato Levinson of Threadneedle Street, redemption by Michaelmas 1817. Marcus set his palm flat over the page as if the words might rise. "Michaelmas is past," he said. "Michaelmas is past by 6 weeks, Your Grace. She has forfeited the parure. She has forfeited the parure to a moneylender who does not lend to duchesses out of admiration for their carriages. She has forfeited it, and she has not told a soul, and the parturer has already been quietly conveyed from Marsden Hall's own strong room to a locked safe in a house in Bishopsgate. Removed when? August last, in a plate chest, under Renshaw's driving." May, from the settle, made a small dry sound that might have been laughter and might have been something else. "Renshaw," she said. "He whipped a groom last spring for asking after a missing bridle. It seems he does not like questions." Marcus turned the page. There were more entries. There were sums lent against a promise of the Marsden Dower House, which was not the dowager's to promise. There were sums lent against the reversion of a farm in Warwickshire, which had been quietly settled upon Philippa in her father's proper will, and would revert to no one but her. There was a note, in Cressida's own crabbed hand, in the margin. "M must go north before Christmas. Levinson will not wait." "M," Marcus said. He did not look up. "Miss Harcourt," said Pennington. "Miss Philippa, the convent in Norfolk. Before Christmas. Before Christmas, your grace." Marcus closed the ledger, very gently, and rested his hand upon it, as though the cloth were warm. He looked toward the window. Outside, somewhere below, a boy was crying the hour. A dog barked at a passing wheel. In the tap room, a woman laughed at something a man had said. The ordinary Tuesday sounds of a Staffordshire market town. How long before she moves the girl? Pennington drew out the 2 envelopes. He laid them side by side. "This," he said, tapping the first, "is the copy of the codicil that I hold in trust. Not the original. That is at Marsden. Or was, at last report. It is no longer at Marsden." Pennington's gray eyes lifted behind the oval glasses. "Miss Harcourt found it," Marcus said. "She has removed it from the house. God be praised. God, and a housekeeper who loved the old Duke better than she loved her wages. Continue." Pennington tapped the second envelope. "This is a letter from Mr. Elias Tracy to the Dowager, dated the 10th of August. In it, he confirms that the false will, executed by him and witnessed by 2 men whose names I have here, will not survive a challenge in Chancery if the original codicil is produced. He warns her, in careful terms, that the original was not among the papers taken from the study. He advises her to search behind Blackstone, which he had believed to be secure, and which, as we now understand, was not." Marcus's mouth moved without sound. "Yes," said Pennington. "He advised her, in this letter, to look precisely where the codicil was hidden. He knew where it was. He was a party to hiding it, or he had been told, or he had guessed, but he knew, and he sold that knowledge to the Dowager for what appears, from a further entry in the ledger, to have been the sum of £400. So she has known since August. Since August. And Miss Harcourt entered the study only a week ago. Yes, your grace. Then it is a race. It has been a race, your grace, since a fortnight before your father died. We are merely the last runners." Marcus lifted the ledger, weighed it in his hand, set it down. He turned toward May. The severe line of his mouth softened without altering. "You wrote to her," he said. May's fingers curled in her shawl. "I wrote to her." "How long?" "Since the funeral. 6 letters. Mrs. Burskoff carried them out with the linen. Miss Harcourt hid them in the lining of her work-basket. She burned them after she had learned them by heart. The 7th she has not burned. She sent it to me the day the 4th of my invitations was thrown into the fire. She said she was to be sent to a convent in Norfolk, and she asked me not to grieve, and she asked me to give you her thanks for the winter roses, if I saw you before the year was out." Marcus stood very still. "You did not tell me. I did not tell you because you were in London, and because you were angry with everyone in a black coat, and because I did not know whether you would ride to Marsden with the codicil in your pocket or with a pistol. I wanted the codicil. You always were the more prudent Bramwell." "I am the one who does not walk," May said. "Prudence is what remains to me." He crossed the room and took her hand and did not speak for a moment. Then he said, "How long has Mrs. Burskoff carried this?" "Since the 4th day of your father's illness. She wrote to Mr. Pennington the night the physician gave up. Mr. Pennington wrote to me. I wrote to Miss Harcourt. Miss Harcourt wrote to me. Mr. Pennington wrote to you, in a letter that reached your regiment 3 days after Corunna and traveled a further 11 weeks before it found you in a Portsmouth infirmary, at which point you were, if I recall correctly, unconscious with fever. I did not read it until March." "No, you did not." He turned back to Pennington. His jaw was set. When he spoke, his voice had cooled. "Mr. Pennington, we do 3 things. We recover the parturer. We do it before the Dowager knows we know. We prepare the Chancery filing so that when we lay the codicil before the master, it lands with the parure at its side and the ledger beneath it. And we place a man at Marsden Hall who can send word the moment the Dowager gives an order for the coach. The last is already arranged, your grace. Mrs. Burskoff has a nephew in the stables. The boy is 15 and can ride, and he has been paid a shilling a week from my own purse since October. Raise him to a crown. With pleasure. The Pursuer. Threadneedle Street. What is Mr. Levinson's price? He will not sell, he will redeem. The debt stands at 2,300, with interest at 8 in the 100 compounded, which brings the sum as of Michaelmas to something above 2,700. He will hold the pursuer against payment of the whole. Once he is paid, he will surrender it. To whom will he surrender it? To the party named upon the pledge, which is the Dowager Duchess of Marsden. He will not surrender it to me. He will not surrender it to your grace. He will surrender it to her grace, or to a person carrying her grace's written authorization and seal. Marcus was silent. Then he smiled, and the smile had no warmth in it, and May looked away because she had seen that smile once before, on a road outside Salamanca, and she preferred not to see it a second time. Then we obtained the seal. Your Grace. Not the seal itself, the impression of it. Mr. Pennington, you have the 2 envelopes on this table. The Dowager's letter to you regarding the terms of the mourning allowance, dated last April, bears her seal. Break the wax, take the impression, and cast a copy in Sheffield plate before Friday. Draft an authorization in her hand. Mrs. Burskoff will provide us with a specimen of that hand within the week. Your Grace, that is forgery. It is the exact forgery for which Mr. Tracy will hang. It is fitting that we borrow his instrument. Pennington held very still. His gray eyes were entirely level behind the round glasses. He was a man who had served 3 Dukes of Marsden, and he had never once in 40 years been asked to falsify a document, and he did not now approve of being asked. I will not do it, Your Grace. Marcus inclined his head. He had expected the refusal, and he respected it, and he did not press. Then we do it another way. Mr. Levinson will not sell to me, but he will sell to a merchant. I have a friend at Barings who owes me a favor that predates Vimero. He will approach Mr. Levinson as a private buyer with cash in hand, offer $3,200 to close the pledge, and pay the difference to Mr. Levinson himself as a discretionary commission. The Dowager will lose the parure, not to us, but to a nameless collector. When she attempts to redeem it in December, she will find it gone. She will inquire. She will trace, if she is clever, no further than a strong box in Threadneedle Street. She will not trace it here. That is not forgery. It is not forgery. It is the ordinary and lawful exchange of a debt on the open market. It is what happens to over-leveraged widows every Michaelmas in this kingdom. Pennington bowed his head slightly. £3,200, Your Grace. I have it, in consols. Sell them today. I will sign whatever paper you place before me before I leave this room. And the parsuer, once obtained, placed in a safe at Bramwell Park, not shown, not spoken of, kept until it is called for, which will be soon. How soon, Your Grace? Marcus looked at the ledger. He looked at the 2 envelopes. He looked at his sister, who was watching him with a face he had not seen on her since childhood, a face that was not brave but was choosing to be brave. Before Christmas, he said. They spent the remainder of that morning in the parlor above the Swan. Pennington drafted 3 separate instruments in his crabbed clean hand, and Marcus signed each with the deliberate care of a man who has learned that signatures cost. A boy was sent to the mail with a letter to Threadneedle Street, sealed under Marcus's own arms, and addressed not to Mr. Levinson, but to Mr. Charles Ashe of Barings and Company, with an enclosure marked, Most Private. A second letter went by fast horse to Bramwell Park, instructing the steward to have the strong room emptied of its silver, and the silver removed to a strong box at Coots, and the strong room made ready to receive a single locked casket, which would arrive under armed escort within the fortnight. A third letter went, by slow post and in an unmarked wrapper, to a certain Mr. Blakely, coroner of the King's Bench, informing him that a matter of falsified probate would in due course require his attention, and requesting that he hold himself in readiness. May took chocolate and dozed with her cheek on the cushion. When she woke, she said, quite clearly and without opening her eyes, I want her at Bramwell for Christmas. That may not be possible. It must be possible. I have not had a friend in 3 years, Marcus. Do not tell me it is not possible. Tell me what it costs. It costs the ruin of a duchess. Then let it cost that. He stood a long moment at the window with his back to the room. Below in the yard the fog had begun to lift, and a farrier's boy was leading a bay mare across the cobbles, and the ordinary decent noise of an English market town rose up, and did not know that anything had changed. You will have her, he said at last, or I will. May opened her eyes. I want her to have herself first. Then you may have her, if she will have you, and I will be at the wedding in a bath chair, and I will throw more petals than a stronger sister might." He did not answer. There was no answer to make. He only turned the signet on his little finger a quarter turn inward and set his palm flat on the sill. That night the news reached them in a form Marcus had not expected. Pennington had gone to lodge across the yard, and May was asleep in the inn's best chamber with her woman on a truckle bed beside her, and Marcus was writing at the small table when a boot scraped in the passage and a hand knocked twice, low and quick. He rose, he drew back the bolt with his left hand and kept his right at his side. The boy who stood there was the stable nephew. Marcus had never seen him. He knew him at once by the cut of his coat and the mud on his knees. The boy was breathing hard. He had ridden from Marsden without changing horses. "Your Grace?" He was too winded to bow. "Mrs. Burskoff sends word. The Dowager has ordered the traveling coach for Miss Harcourt tomorrow at first light, to Norfolk, under Renshaw." "When did the order go?" "This evening at 7. I rode from Marsden at past. The Greys are behind me. I did not stop." "You will stop now. Sit, eat, send the innkeeper up." The boy sat and did not eat, because his hands were shaking too much to hold anything. Marcus poured brandy into a small glass and put the glass into the boy's fingers and closed the fingers around it. "How is Miss Harcourt?" "Quiet, Your Grace. She sewed all day. She sewed a thing into a hem." "What thing?" The boy hesitated. "Mrs. Burskoff did not say, Your Grace, only that Miss Harcourt would not part with her work-basket, and that she carried it herself down the servants' stair before dawn." Marcus stood a long moment with his hand on the boy's shoulder. "You have done well. Sleep. In the morning you will ride back with a letter I shall give you. You will give it to Mrs. Burskoff and to no one else. You will not speak to Renshaw. You will not look at the Dowager. Do you understand me?" "Yes, Your Grace." "Have you a mother?" "A grandmother, Your Grace." "In Wolverhampton? Tell her when this is done that a duke has stood at your elbow and been glad of it." He crossed the yard in the dark and knocked at Pennington's window. Pennington opened it in his shirt and cap. "Norfolk, tomorrow at first light." Pennington did not exclaim. He never exclaimed. He said only, "Then we are 3 days ahead of ourselves and 2 days behind. We are ahead on the Perwoicher and behind on the girl. We cannot be at Marsden by first light. We can be on the north road from Uttoxeter by first light. Renshaw will not run the Greys direct to Norfolk. He will bait them at the rising sun and change at Uttoxeter. If we ride tonight, we meet the coach on the road between Marsden and Uttoxeter at some point after 9. Your Grace, you have not slept in 36 hours, and your leg—" "My leg has ridden farther than this on less. Have the ostler ready fresh horses at 2. I go and I come back before we set off. May must be told." He went back across the yard through a light snow that had begun to fall. He climbed the stair. He entered his sister's room without a candle, sat down on the edge of the bed, and touched her wrist. She did not startle. She had been waiting. "They send her tomorrow," he said. "I ride tonight. Take Mrs. Ash's Bible." "Whatever for?" "Because you have not carried anything but a pistol in a great while, and I would prefer that you carry something else as well. It is under the pillow." He drew out a small worn book bound in black calf. He put it into the deep inside pocket of his greatcoat, where the pocket watch usually lay. "Bring her back," May said. "I will. Bring her back alive." He was quiet. "Marcus, alive." "Yes." He kissed her forehead. He left the room. At Marsden that same night, Cressida stood in the winter drawing-room with her back to a very small fire. The room was cold because she had ordered the coals rationed for the morning quarter, and now, at nearly midnight, the last log was down to a heart of orange. She was not cold. She had put on a shawl of fine wool over her half-mourning, and she held in one hand a folded sheet that had arrived by messenger from London that afternoon. The letter was from Mr. Cato Levinson of Threadneedle Street. It informed her Grace, with the greatest respect, that the pledge upon the parure had been the subject of an unsolicited approach by a private buyer of considerable resources, and that Mr. Levinson, being a man of business, felt himself obliged to inform her Grace before entertaining the offer any further, and to inquire whether her Grace intended to redeem the pledge upon or before the 15th of the present month, in which case Mr. Levinson would happily decline the buyer and hold the parure at her Grace's disposal. She had read the letter 3 times. She had read the date of postmarking twice. The letter had been written before Pennington had left London. It had been written before Marcus had reached Lichfield. It meant that the buyer had approached Mr. Levinson unprompted, by his own initiative, at exactly the moment she could least afford to lose the pledge, and had exactly no means of redeeming it. Somewhere, another player had entered the field. She did not yet think of Marcus. She thought of the moneylender's cousin in Bristol, of a certain Sir Peter Halliwell who had once admired the Perrier at a Twelfth Night ball, of a nameless collector in Amsterdam, of half a dozen possibilities before she reached the possibility of a Bramwell, and when she reached that possibility, she set it aside, because Marcus of Bramwell was in London and knew nothing, and if he had known anything he would have written, and he had not written. But she also knew that Miss Harcourt had entered the study. She knew from Tracy's white face when she had questioned him. She knew because a candle had been lit in the north wing at the wrong hour and a maid had spoken of a moving shadow. She knew then that everything depended upon Miss Harcourt reaching the convent by Sunday. Once the girl was walled in, once the vows were spoken under duress, and the door was closed, the codicil in her possession, if she had it, would be nothing but a piece of vellum in the hands of a woman the world would no longer see. Renshaw had his orders. The coach would leave at 5. It would travel by way of Uttoxeter to Melton Mowbray, then east through Grantham to King's Lynn, then north to a small cold house on the Norfolk coast, where a woman with a very keen practical mind kept house for a bishop's cousin. Miss Harcourt would arrive at that house by Saturday night. She would enter the convent on Monday morning. She would not, if Cressida had reckoned rightly, be permitted to write letters for a full year. She refolded the letter from Mr. Levinson. She placed it on the small table beside the fire. She did not burn it. She wished to have it as evidence, at some future date, of the interference of persons unknown. At the door Renshaw scratched, softly. "Your Grace." "Yes. The coach is ready." "Miss Harcourt has been told to be dressed at 4. Has she asked why the hour is so early?" "She has not asked, Your Grace." "That is unusual. She has been very quiet, Your Grace. Yesterday she sewed for 6 hours. She has taken no supper." Cressida turned her head. "She has not eaten." "No, Your Grace." "Then have cook make up a basket for the road, cold fowl and a jar of preserve. I will not have it said that I sent a Marsden into Norfolk without a basket." Renshaw bowed. He hesitated. "Your Grace, the road past Uttoxeter is uncertain in this weather. There is talk of the Trent flooding. If we are delayed—" "You will not be delayed. If the water is high, you will use the upper road through Sudbury. If a wheel breaks, you will hire another coach at the first posting inn and pay in gold, and you will send the account to Mr. Tracy. Whatever you do, Renshaw, you will place that girl on the doorstep of a house I have named to you before Sunday sundown. Do you understand me?" "Yes, Your Grace." "Look at me when I say it." He looked. His pale blue eyes did not hold. She saw in them the flicker she had learned to know, the flicker of a man calculating whether the coin she paid was greater than the price he would pay if the road went wrong. It was still greater. "Just go," she said. He went. She stood a long moment before the very small fire. Then she opened the fire screen, took up the letter from Mr. Levinson, and, after all, dropped it into the heart of the log. The heart of the log accepted it. The paper went blue, then white, then black. When it was black, she turned away and rang the bell for her maid and went upstairs to bed, because a duchess who intends to burn her stepdaughter's life to the ground must nevertheless be seen at breakfast fresh and composed, and inquiring after the health of her housekeeper. By 2:30, Marcus and Pennington were mounted in the yard of the Swan. The snow had thickened, the horses stamped. Pennington, wrapped in 3 cloaks and looking 80 rather than 62, had refused to be left behind. "You will die of the cold," Marcus said. "I have not survived 4 chanceries and a wife of 40 years in order to die at a horse's neck in Staffordshire. Ride, Your Grace." Marcus turned in the saddle. He looked up at the lighted window under the eaves where May's woman was drawing the curtain. He raised his gloved hand. Then he set his heels to the horse, and the two of them rode out of the yard of the Swan, north by Rugeley, north by Abbots Bromley, north into a snow that fell now in steady soft flakes, and the codicil was 3 days ridden ahead of them wrapped in a work-basket, and the coach that carried it had not yet started, and somewhere on the road between Marsden and Uttoxeter, a woman in half-mourning was about to lean out of a door and demand a package she had already lost. Trentham House opened its doors on a Thursday evening thick with London rain, and the wet cobbles of Grosvenor Square glittered under the flambeau like a wide, dark river. Carriages lined the curb 3 deep. Footmen in scarlet livery ran with umbrellas. Under the portico, the guests shook themselves free of the weather and passed beneath a great chandelier already blazing at 8. Cressida Harcourt, Dowager Duchess of Marsden, ascended the marble stair with the calm of a general reviewing a familiar field. She had lightened her half-mourning for the occasion. The lavender silk was still there, but the crepe was gone, and a single row of jet beads at her throat did the work of grief without its inconvenience. Her fan was closed, her mouth was neutral. Only her pale green eyes moved, and they moved constantly, cataloguing. Behind her walked Philippa in the same faded puce muslin she had worn for 2 seasons, hastily let out at the seams and freshened with a new ribbon Mrs. Burskoff had found in a drawer. The camophore of Marsden ivory hung on a black cord under the bodice, where it always hung. Cressida had allowed her to come. That fact, more than any other in the house, told Philippa to be careful. At the head of the stair, Lady Trentham received them with the wide, empty smile she used for country cousins. She kissed the air near Cressida's cheek. She let her eyes slide across Philippa without pausing, as if the girl were a piece of furniture she had not yet decided where to place. Philippa curtsied to the exact depth propriety required, and half an inch beyond it. "Marsden," said Lady Trentham, taking the older woman's hand with the intimacy of a schoolroom friendship. "How brave of you to venture out in this weather. And your poor stepdaughter. Quite the figure." "Quite," said Cressida. The word held nothing at all. They moved into the long gallery. The orchestra had already begun a set of country dances. The scent of hothouse roses fought with the hair powder of the older women, and beneath both ran the sharper note of wet wool from 100 cloaks now dripping in the vestibule. Cressida did not go towards the dancers. She turned instead, with the unhurried certainty of a woman who has planned her evening as one plans a small campaign, and made for the ottoman where Lady Agatha Pelham held court. Lady Pelham was, as ever, upholstered rather than dressed. The episcopal purple satin of her gown had been let out again, and the turban above her white curls stood a full 9 inches tall, crowned by an ostrich plume dyed the same imperial hue. A lorgnette dangled from a gold chain. 2 younger women flanked her, hoping to be noticed. When she saw Cressida approach, she lifted the lorgnette without disguise. "Marsden," she said, "you have brought the girl. I have brought my late husband's daughter. It was not a decision made lightly. No decision of yours ever is." Lady Pelham let the lorgnette drop. "Sit." Cressida sat. Philippa remained standing at a distance suitable for a companion, a half step behind and to the left, hands folded, eyes on the pattern of the parquet. "Well?" said Lady Pelham. Cressida glanced at the 2 younger women. They withdrew, as if a hand had swept them off the board. She waited 3 heartbeats after they were out of earshot. Then she leaned very slightly forward, and her voice dropped to the pitch she used only for money and marriages. "Agatha, I need a small favor. You need a large one, or you would not have made me stand up from a good chair. The voucher for Almack's. My stepdaughter, as you see, is here. There has been talk, kindly meant, of introducing her at the assemblies. It would be an unkindness." Lady Pelham's small black eyes traveled once over Philippa, from the mended hem to the coil of hair at the nape. They saw everything they had been trained to see. Because, said Cressida, quieter still, there are questions about the late Duke's papers that ought to be settled before a girl in her position steps into an assembly room. Questions of parentage, questions of provenance. The plume above Lady Pelham's turban did not quiver. That was the mark of the professional. She said nothing for perhaps 4 seconds. Then, "You would put your name to that?" "I would put a whisper to it. My name I keep for the pulpit. A whisper travels farther than a name. That is why I brought her." Philippa, from her half-step behind, heard none of it distinctly. The orchestra was too loud, the crowd too close, and Cressida's voice had gone into that low register she used when she meant to be unheard. What Philippa saw was Lady Pelham's lorgnette rise a second time, hover on her face longer than politeness permitted, and lower again with a slight, decisive nod. She saw her stepmother sit back. She saw Lady Pelham reach for her fan and open it in the closed language of the patronesses, 3 ribs showing, a language Philippa did not read. Across the gallery, the closed fan was read at once. A dowager near the pianoforte tilted her head towards her neighbor. A word crossed the room in the shape of a smile. By the time the country dance ended, 4 women knew that the Marsden girl was not to be considered, and by the time the next dance began, 6 more knew why in outline, though the outline shifted with each telling. Cressida rose. "Come, Philippa." They walked the length of the gallery. Cressida bowed to a bishop's wife who did not bow back. She smiled at a viscountess who suddenly needed to speak with someone on the other side of the room. A gentleman who had once written to the late Duke bent over Cressida's hand and did not lift his eyes to the young woman behind her. Every failed acknowledgement was a small brick laid on Philippa's shoulders. She kept her chin level. She had promised her father, once, in a way children promise things they do not fully understand, that she would not carry his name badly. She was not carrying it badly now. She was carrying it like a bucket of water that had begun to be too heavy to hold at arm's length. By the 3rd quarter of an hour, the room had made up its mind. 2 young men who had been introduced to her at the beginning of the season crossed the room to speak to her, and found themselves intercepted by their mothers with an efficiency that would have been comic in a farce. A dowager Philippa had known since childhood turned her shoulder as she passed. The famous Miss Everleigh, who was supposed to be Philippa's particular friend, smiled uncertainly and drifted towards the supper room without waiting for her. Cressida saw all of it and let none of it show. She sipped a glass of orgeat. She spoke of the weather at Marsden. She corrected the count of the hothouse pineapples with the wife of an ambassador. In her mind she was already writing the letter she would send in the morning, and the note she would send tonight to Mr. Elias Tracy, and the instructions she would give to the coachman Renshaw before dawn. The bottom was reached, for Philippa, when Lady Trentham herself, having taken counsel of Lady Pelham near the card-room, approached with an expression composed of infinite regret and the finality of a closing door. "My dear child," said Lady Trentham, addressing Philippa, but looking at Cressida, "I fear this is not, perhaps, quite the right evening for you. So much dancing, so much stairs. Your dear stepmother's carriage, I believe, could easily take you home. We shall see you when there is more air in the room." There was no answer to be made. Philippa curtsied. She said, "Your ladyship is very kind." She turned. Cressida did not look at her. Cressida was smiling at Lady Trentham, with the exact warmth appropriate to the sending home of an inconvenience. Only in the vestibule, standing among the wet cloaks while a footman went to fetch her pelisse, did Philippa allow herself one physical concession. She pressed her palm flat against the plaster of the wall behind her. The cold of it went through her glove. She counted to 7. She lowered her hand. When the footman returned, her face was composed. The Marsden town coach was old, its cushions cracked, its lamp weak against the London rain. Renshaw sat on the box with his shoulders hunched. He did not turn as she was handed in. He never did. She had known him all her life, since he had lifted her onto her first pony at 6, and for years he had lifted his hat when she passed. Since the old Duke's death, he had not once met her eye. She noticed it again tonight, as she noticed the way his hands sat too still on the reins, and she understood, without being told, that whatever her stepmother had commanded that evening had already reached the servants' hall. The coach rolled through Piccadilly and turned north. Rain drummed the roof. Philippa sat with the camphor of Marsden ivory pressed into the flat of her hand under the shawl, and she thought of the packet of puce velvet hidden in the false bottom of her workbox at the hall, and of Mrs. Burscought's whisper about Blackstone, and of a man named Bramwell whom she had never seen, and whose signature she had read 3 times by candlelight in the codicil. Executor. He would be, if he cared to be, either her salvation or the last man to close the lid. The coach reached the Marsden townhouse in Wimpole Street a little after 11. Cressida had not returned. Philippa was met at the door by a chambermaid who would not look at her, and by a message that her stepmother wished the household ready to travel to the hall at first light. She did not sleep. She sat by the small fire in her borrowed dressing room and let the candle burn down. Somewhere on Pall Mall, Cressida Harcourt was dictating to Mr. Tracy the substance of a letter that would name the Reverend Mother of a convent in Norfolk and the sum of £200 for the girl's board. Somewhere further west, at his lodgings in Duke Street, a man with a limp in his right leg was folding a letter from Mr. Ambrose Pennington and marking upon a map in pencil a line from London to Marsden to Uttoxeter. At first light, the Marsden coach was at the door. 2 traveling trunks were on the boot, and one of them was not Philippa's. Her stepmother, in a fresh grey pelisse with black frogging, stood on the pavement giving orders to Renshaw in an undertone. She turned when Philippa came down. "We leave for the country in an hour," said Cressida. "There has been quite enough London." "Yes, madam. You will pack whatever fits in the smaller valise. The rest will follow." "Yes, madam." There was no mention of the convent. That was Cressida's way. The convent would be mentioned when they were 50 miles north of Grantham, and no house within 12 miles had a name Philippa knew. Until then, it would live in her stepmother's mind as a fact, and Philippa would live with the fact circling her ankles. She went upstairs. She took the smaller valise. In it she placed a linen shift, a pair of stockings, a spare fichu, her prayer book, a needle case, and, at the bottom, the puce velvet packet with the codicil sewn between 2 layers of it. The seal of the late Duke of Marsden pressed once into black wax, and still, after all these months, whole. The house at Wimpole Street was quiet when the coach pulled away. The rain of the night had lifted to a slow grey mist. As they turned into Oxford Street, Renshaw's whip rose and dropped without cracking, and Cressida, opposite Philippa in the coach, opened a small tortoise-shell writing case on her knees and began to compose, in a careful, level hand, the letter she meant to have ready when they stopped at St. Albans to change horses. Philippa watched her stepmother write. She watched the small movements of Cressida's mouth as she formed a difficult phrase, the way she paused to consider a word, the way she scored one out with a single decisive line. She thought, without allowing the thought to reach her face, that in that neat penmanship 100 lives had already been arranged and rearranged, and that her own was being arranged now, on paper worth a shilling a quire. They stopped at St. Albans at midday. Cressida descended and disappeared into the parlor of the George with her writing case. Philippa was ordered to remain in the coach. Renshaw walked the horses in the yard, not looking at her. A boy brought a small tray of tea and cold beef to the coach window and did not lift his cap. She ate a little. She drank the tea, which was strong. She looked out at the yard and at the London road behind them, and she saw, or thought she saw, a black horse in the distance under a rider with a military seat, but the horse turned into an inn-yard on the far side of the town and did not reappear. Cressida returned. In her hand was a sealed letter. She gave it to Renshaw. She did not tell Philippa what it was, and Philippa did not ask. She did not need to. In her mind she saw the address as clearly as if Cressida had spoken it. It went to a lay establishment on the Norfolk coast whose name she had heard once as a child, in the tone people used for prisons. The coach turned north. By the middle of the afternoon, Marsden Hall lay ahead of them, its familiar chimneys smoking gray against a low sky. They did not stop at the front. Cressida ordered the coach round to the stable court, and there, in the cold light of a raw November afternoon, she descended and gave Renshaw a second set of instructions in a voice too quiet for Philippa to hear. Renshaw touched his hat. He did not look at Philippa as she was handed down. Cressida turned to her. "You will go to your room. You will not come down for dinner. Mrs. Burscough will bring you a tray. In the morning we speak." "Yes, madam." Philippa climbed the north stair carrying the smaller valise herself. No servant offered to take it. When she reached the corridor at the top, Mrs. Burscough was waiting, an iron ring of keys silent at her waist, her white apron impeccable, her round face composed. She let Philippa pass her and followed her into the room. "Miss Philippa." "Mrs. Burscough." The older woman closed the door behind her with a care that made no sound. She crossed to the window. She drew the curtain a hand's breadth further, so that anyone in the courtyard below would see a curtain drawn against the cold and nothing more. Then she came back. "They are packing the Norfolk trunk," she said, low. Philippa set the valise on the bed. "When?" "Before first light. She has sent Renshaw with a note to hire outriders at Uddoxeter. She will not travel it herself. She will send you with him and Mr. Tracy." "Mr. Tracy. He came in by the London coach an hour after we did. He is in the small parlor now with a bottle of the late Duke's Madeira and a letter he does not want to sign." Philippa sat down on the edge of the bed. She placed her hands flat on her knees, she said, without looking up. "And you know this how?" "I know it because I have served in this house 41 years and every hinge in it speaks to me." Mrs. Burscough reached into her apron and produced a small square of folded linen. "Give me the packet, miss." Philippa did not move. "Miss Philippa, the packet." The girl reached for the valise. She undid the strap. She took out the puce velvet. She did not surrender it. She held it in her lap. "I am to sew a line into the lining of your traveling pelisse," said Mrs. Burskoff, "where they will not think to look. Only a line. 4 words. It is the last help I can give you before they take you off my ground." "What words?" "Bramwell knows. Endure." Philippa's throat closed. She did not weep. She had not wept since the funeral. She was not going to begin now, in a room in her own father's house, with the woman who had brought her a peeled apple every winter afternoon of her childhood, standing over her with a needle already threaded. She lifted the puce velvet packet and set it back into the valise. She rose. She took the gray traveling pelisse from the press. She handed it to Mrs. Burskoff. The old woman sat at the small table by the window. She spread the pelisse across her broad lap, wrong side up. She parted the lining at the seam over the left breast, where a heart would be if a garment had one, and she began to sew. She sewed the 4 words into the flannel interlining in a stitch so small it would take a magnifying glass to read. Bramwell knows, endure. Between each word she paused to pass the needle through beeswax so the thread would not creak. She did not speak while she worked. Philippa stood at the window and watched the darkening yard. Below her, in the stable court, Renshaw was checking the wheels of the traveling chariot by lantern light. 2 ostlers were putting fresh straw in the boot. A boy was rubbing down a fresh pair of horses. Everything was being made ready with the quiet efficiency of a household that had done such journeys before. Mrs. Burskoff. "Yes, miss." "If Bramwell does not know," the needle did not pause, "then you endure until he does. And if he never does, then you endure anyway. You are your father's daughter. He would want no less of you, and he would want no more. He would want you upright." The needle went through, came back, went through. "There, it is done." She bit off the thread. She shook out the pelisse and held it up. On the outside, the gray wool looked as it had that morning. Shabby at the cuffs, patched once at the elbow, honestly cared for. On the inside, over the heart, the flannel bore 4 words that no eye but hers and Philippa's would ever find. She helped the girl into it. "Wear it as you sleep, if you can," she said. "They will not think to search a coat you are wearing." Philippa nodded. Mrs. Burskoff went to the door. She paused with her hand on the latch. She did not turn. She spoke to the door. "When you are on the road tomorrow, if there is any moment when you may open the coach door and step down at a coaching inn, do so. Any inn. Ask for pen and paper. Write 1 line to the Duke of Bramwell at Bramwell Park in Herefordshire. Give it to a boy with a coin and tell him to run it to the nearest posting house. Do not trust Renshaw. Do not trust Tracy. Do not trust the drivers of any post they will take you to. Mrs. Burskoff. Miss Philippa. If they will not let me down." The old woman still did not turn. Her shoulders under the black bombazine were very square. "Then you keep the packet on your person and you wait. That man has a debt to your father. He does not yet know he can pay. He will pay it." She opened the door and went out. The latch caught behind her with a small, final click. Philippa stood alone in the room. The candle guttered. The fire, which no one had come to feed, had settled into red coals. She sat at the writing table by the window. She did not light a fresh candle. She did not need to see. She drew a sheet of paper out of the drawer and, in the failing light, she wrote 3 lines. She wrote, "If any harm come to me on the Norfolk road, look in the false bottom of the workbox in the north sewing room. Blackstone is on the shelf above. Everything my father meant is inside." She wrote, "I am not going to a convent by my own consent." She wrote, "I am my father's daughter, and I do not surrender." She folded the paper. She addressed it in a hand she made deliberately clumsy, so that no one would recognize it as hers. To Mr. Ambrose Pennington, solicitor, Lichfield. She slipped the letter into the crown of Mrs. Burskoff's old sewing basket by the door, where the old woman would find it at dawn. Then she took the puce velvet packet out of the valise, and, with the small pair of scissors she carried in her work-bag, she opened a second seam. She undid the stitches Mrs. Burskoff had shown her in September at the lining of her stays. She placed the codicil, still in its outer wrapper of grease paper, inside the linen of the stays, over her hip, where no hand short of an outright search would find it. She sewed the seam shut again, in the same small stitches Mrs. Burskoff used, with the same beeswax she had watched the old woman lift from her apron pocket. When she had finished, she stood up. She put on the gray pelisse. She buttoned it. She sat down again in the chair by the dying fire. She had not yet decided whether she would sleep or wait for the knock at the door. The knock came at 4 in the morning. It was not Mrs. Burskoff. It was a young chambermaid Philippa did not know well, with a candle in her hand and eyes that would not meet her face. "Her Grace is ready, miss." Philippa rose. She lifted the valise. She followed the girl down the north stair. The hall was dark. The clocks in the corridor kept ticking as if it were an hour like any other. At the foot of the stair, Cressida was waiting in her lavender pelisse, drawing on her black gloves finger by finger. "Get in," she said. Philippa got in. Mr. Elias Tracy was already inside, on the rear-facing seat. He had not shaved. His cravat was tied wrong. He would not look at her either. Cressida stepped in after her and settled opposite, arranging her skirts. "Where?" said Philippa, and she found her voice steady. "Are we going, madam?" "To take the air," said Cressida. Renshaw's whip cracked once. The horses leaned into their collars. The traveling chariot rolled out of the stable court of Marsden Hall onto the drive, past the old cedar the second Duke had planted, past the lodge with its dark windows, out through the gate onto the Uttoxeter road. There was no groom on the box. There was no maid in the boot. There was only Renshaw driving, and Tracy with the letter in his coat, and Cressida across from Philippa with her tortoise-shell writing case flat on her knees again, as if the road were a desk. Rain began at the second milestone. It fell steady and cold on the roof and slid in silver lines down the coach windows. Cressida did not open her case. She sat very still, her pale eyes fixed on Philippa's face. At the third milestone she spoke. "You went into the cabinet in October," she said. Philippa did not answer. "On the night of the Michaelmas rain, you had the key. It is not in Pennington's chambers. It is not in his lodgings. That leaves you." Philippa's hand, under the fold of the pelisse, closed very lightly on the place at her hip, where the codicil lay against her stays. She did not let her eyes drop to it. "Whatever you took," said Cressida, "you will now give me." "I took," said Philippa, "a book of my father's sermons. It is on the shelf by my bed." "You took a packet." "There was no packet." Cressida's mouth thinned. She turned her head to the window. She watched the wet fields go by. She said, in a voice so calm it might have been discussing the weather, "The convent at Wellsprings has been advised to expect a young woman of unsettled mind who will need firm care. Mr. Tracy carries the letter of consignment. It is signed by me as your nearest guardian. It will be signed by you when we stop at Uttoxeter." "I shall not sign it." "You shall." "I shall not." Cressida smiled. It was the smile she used at balls with women she meant to ruin. "Child, you are alone in a coach on a road in the rain, with 2 people in my employ. You will sign, or the road will be very long." The coach rolled on. Somewhere behind them, in the gray, wet dawn, another rider had left London the previous evening and had spent the night changing horses at Barnet and St. Albans and Northampton and Lichfield, and was now less than an hour behind on a chestnut gelding that had been bred for such work. Behind him, in a hired chaise, rode Mr. Ambrose Pennington with the second envelope on his knees and his oval spectacles slipping down his nose. Neither party in the traveling chariot knew this. Cressida looked out at the rain and calculated the miles to Uttoxeter. Tracy stared at his boots. Philippa kept her hand at her hip, and her eyes on the middle distance and her breathing slow. She had already decided, in the hour before the knock, that she would not sign the letter. She had already decided that when the door of the chariot opened at the next post, she would step down and speak to the innkeeper, whoever he was, in her own name and her father's name, and let the consequences fall where they fell. She had already decided that if she could not step down at the post, she would open the door herself between posts, at a slow bend or a hill, and take her chances with the road. She had come down as low as her stepmother could bring her, and she had found, at the bottom of it, that there was still one thing she owned that Cressida could not take without her consent. The moment at which she said no. That moment was coming. It was coming somewhere between the 3rd and the 7th milestone. It would come at a door that was still, at this hour, latched from the inside on the near side of the chariot, and the latch would lift under her own hand. The rain grew heavier. The wheels struck a rut, and the whole coach swayed. Cressida steadied her writing case with one gloved hand. Tracy licked his lips. Renshaw's whip cracked twice. And ahead of them, hidden by a bend in the road and a stand of black winter trees, The Uddexeter Turnpike waited, and beyond it the long straight where the ground fell away to the Dove, and beyond that, the point at which a woman in half-mourning would lean out of a door and demand a package she had already lost. The coach reached the long straight above the Dove, and the ground began to fall away on the left, a soft dark tilt of winter grass slick with rain. Philippa braced her boot against the opposite bench. The velvet bundle sat in her lap, small and heavy, warm from being pressed to her ribs for 2 hours. Cressida watched it. She had watched it since Marsden. She had watched it through the changing of horses at the turnpike, through the toll-keeper's slow hand on the gate, through Tracy's third attempt at a joke that no one had laughed at. Her verdant eyes did not move. They rested on the fold of puce velvet with the patience of a cat that has decided which sparrow to take. "Give it to me," she said. Philippa did not answer. Rain drummed on the roof. Renshaw's whip snapped once above the wheelers, then again, and the coach lurched forward into the straight. Tracy pressed himself into the corner and made himself smaller. He had understood, some minutes back, that he was no longer required in the conversation. "Philippa," Cressida said. Her voice was low and level, the voice she used at prayers. "You will hand it to me now." "No, madam." The word was quiet. It was the first time in 19 years that Philippa had used it without a curtsy attached. Cressida's gloved fingers tightened on the ivory ribs of her fan. The fan did not open. It only bent, very slightly, the way a green stick bends before it breaks. "You have been in the study," she said. "Yes, madam." "At night." "Yes." "Alone." "Yes." Each answer was a small stone laid on a wall. Philippa did not lift her eyes from her stepmother's face. She had watched that face all her life. She had watched it lie to visitors, to solicitors, to bishops. She had watched it lie into her father's coffin. She did not intend to watch it lie anymore. "You broke a lock," Cressida said. "The key was given to me." "By whom?" "By a friend of my father's." The fan bent a fraction further. Tracy coughed. Outside, the rain came harder, and the light thinned to the color of pewter. Somewhere ahead, a rook called and was answered. "Give it to me," Cressida said again, and now the voice was different. The prayers were gone from it. "Give it to me, and I will send you to Norfolk instead of Yorkshire. The Norfolk house has a garden. You are fond of gardens." "I am fond of my inheritance, madam." The words were out before Philippa had decided to say them. She heard them land in the closed air of the coach, and she did not take them back. Cressida went very still. It was the stillness of a woman who has just been shown a card she did not know was in the deck. Her mouth did not move. Her eyes did not widen. Only the small vein at her left temple, the one Philippa had studied as a child while being scolded, filled with a slow blue thread. "Repeat that," she said. "You heard me, madam. Repeat it." Philippa did not repeat it. She only lifted the bundle a little higher in her lap, where the light from the coach lamp could find the puce nap of the velvet. Cressida's gaze went to it, went to Philippa's face, went to the door. Later, Philippa would try to remember which of those 3 things her stepmother had looked at last, and she would not be able to. There would only be the sudden shape of Cressida rising in the swaying coach, one hand still on the writing case, the other reaching not for the bundle, but for the leather strap above the door. "Renshaw," Cressida called, not loud, not shrill, simply as though ordering tea. "Stop the horses." The wheels slowed. The whip did not crack. Renshaw, on the box, had heard something in the voice below him that made him slack the reins without asking why. The coach dragged, jolted, dragged again as the wheelers dropped from trot to walk. Rain hissed on the lamps. The near side lamp guttered and steadied. Tracy pressed both hands flat against the seat and stared at his knees. "Madam," Philippa said. She kept her voice even. It cost her more than she would ever admit. "Whatever you intend, I would ask you to think of my father." "I have thought of your father," Cressida said, "for 11 years. She turned the door handle. The door swung out into the rain. The coach was still moving, not quickly, perhaps at the pace of a brisk walk. The near side wheel found a rut, and the whole body of the carriage tilted, and the wet dark hedgerow slid past the open frame, like a river passing a boat. Cold air poured in. The lamp guttered again. Cressida looked at her stepdaughter for one long unhurried second, and in that second, Philippa saw, quite clearly, that her stepmother was not angry. Anger would have been a kindness. What sat behind those verdant eyes was arithmetic. "I am sorry, my dear," Cressida said. "There has been a dreadful accident." She reached across the swaying interior with both hands and she pushed. It was not a violent shove, it was measured. It was the movement of a woman placing a vase on a shelf, just slightly out of reach. The heel of her right glove caught Philippa under the collarbone, and the flat of her left glove caught her at the hip, and Philippa, whose boot was braced but whose spine was not, went over sideways through the open frame. The velvet bundle went with her. She struck the road on her shoulder first, then her hip, then the side of her jaw, and the world rolled, once, twice, before the ditch caught her and held her. The coach kept going for perhaps 10 yards. Then Renshaw, at last, hauled on the reins. The wheelers threw their heads. The whole carriage shuddered to a halt on the wet stones. Silence. Rain on the ditchwater, rain on the puce velvet, half open now against Philippa's hand, showing the corner of a sealed parchment as thick as a prayer book. Rain on the small white scar on the back of that hand. She did not cry out. That was the thing Cressida would remember afterwards, in the 6 days between the ball and the writ. Not the fall, not the jolt of the coach, not Tracy's whimper. The silence. The girl in the ditch had not cried out. The girl in the ditch had not even looked up. The girl in the ditch had simply put her hand over the parchment and held it against the mud as though it were her father's hand. Cressida stepped down from the coach. She stepped carefully. She did not want to soil the hem of her half-mourning. The lavender crepe swept the wet stones and drew a dark line along the road. She walked the 10 yards back with the unhurried carriage of a woman entering a drawing room. Tracy scrambled after her and slipped and caught himself on the door and did not follow further. "Philippa," Cressida said pleasantly, standing over the ditch. "Give it to me now, child. There is no need for further drama." Philippa raised her head. Blood ran from her lip. Her bonnet was gone. Half her hair had come out of its coil and lay wet along her neck. She looked up through the rain at her stepmother and she smiled. It was a small, exhausted, entirely astonished smile, because she had just understood something she had not understood before. She had understood that she had won. Cressida had come down from the coach. Cressida was standing on the road. Cressida had left the door open. The horses stopped, the box empty of orders, the ditch full of witnesses in the shape of parchment and mud, and a girl who was still breathing. Cressida had, for the first time in 11 years, made a mistake. "You should not have stopped, madam," Philippa said. Cressida's face did not change. Then, from the rise of ground behind them, a horse called. It was not a coach horse. It was a hunter, deep-chested, and its call cut through the rain the way a bell cuts through fog. A second call answered it. Cressida's head turned very slowly. Tracy made a small, unhappy noise. Renshaw, on the box, gathered his reins tighter and did not look round. 2 riders came over the rise. They came at a hand canter, side by side, cloaks black with rain. The one on the left rode straight-backed on a gray. The one on the right sat a bay with a slight favoring of the near stirrup, as a man rides who has an old wound in his right thigh and has learned to distribute his weight. Under the brim of his beaver hat, his eyes found the coach, the open door, the woman standing on the stones, the puce shape in the ditch. The bay's stride did not change, only the reins shortened. Cressida's hand went to her throat. Marcus rode the last 20 yards at a trot. He drew up not at the coach but at the ditch. He did not dismount at once. He looked down at Philippa in the mud, at the blood on her lip, at the bundle under her hand. Something moved behind his ice-blue eyes and was put away. Then he swung down. He came off the bay in one motion, sound leg first, and even in that motion the limp was visible, the small pause as the right knee took his weight. He did not favor it now. He walked into the ditch as though the ditch were a drawing-room carpet, and he knelt in the mud on both knees, and he did not touch her. "Miss Harcourt, Your Grace, are you injured? I do not know yet. May I lift you?" "In a moment." He nodded once. He waited. Rain ran off the brim of his hat onto the shoulder of his greatcoat and from there to the mud. Behind him, Pennington had dismounted more slowly, the leather satchel already unbuckled at his side, the gold-rimmed spectacles fogged and being wiped on a corner of his cravat. "The package, Miss Harcourt," Marcus said, still not touching her. "Under my hand. May I?" "Yes." He drew the bundle out from under her palm. The puce velvet fell open. Inside, the parchment lay dry, the seal intact, the red wax whole, the impression of the old Duke's ring clear as though it had been pressed that morning. Marcus did not open it. He passed it, without looking, over his shoulder to Pennington.